Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, sometimes Mother Fate holds you gently by the hand and takes you on an unlikely journey that you never imagined for your life. A nudge here and a nudge there, she guides you gracefully down the path. And if you're reluctant to move forward, she can give you a forceful push so that you'll end up on the path that was ordained for you before you were even born. I'm in no doubt that this is what happened to me. Growing up as a young boy, there was one place I loved in town more than anywhere else, more than the old-fashioned sweet shop, more than the ice cream parlour, and more than the diner that made the best all-American burgers that you've ever tasted. If you haven't guessed yet, it was the old antique bookshop on the corner of Main Street that was reminiscent of bygone times, as the shop possessed a vintage retrograde allure. There was an emerald green awning framing the exterior windows, embossed with white italic writing that read The Wizened Friend. Then there was a magnificent display of books always in the window that would completely hijack your attention, and it was impossible not to stop and read all the beguiling new titles that would leave a book enthusiast like myself salivating. The next thing you would know is that a tiny little voice in your head would say, "I'll just go in there for a minute. Only a minute, that's all." Then you would push open the glass door, and the inside silvery bell would tinkle to alert the owner, Mr. Wright, to his new customer. That was the moment when one was inclined to feel rather awkward and self-conscious, but the magnetic enticement of those books was quite literally insatiable, and easily overcame any reticence on my part, as the collective woody, smoky, earthy and vanilla aroma of this tranquil sanctuary or oasis of books was quite arresting. Mr. Wright was in his early 70s at the time. He was passionate about his little business and loved all books, whether old or new. A short man, young for his age, without a single grey hair on his head. A smooth, unlined complexion, hazel brown eyes framed by round glasses that made him look like a wizened owl. When you entered his shops, he would study you from behind his old-fashioned cash register and address you by name. "Hello, Jamie. And how are you today, young man? What can I do for you?" he would ask. I would answer very politely and say, "I'm just looking, Mr. Wright. Just looking. Thank you very much." "Be my guest," he would say. "Give me a shout if you need my help in anything." My heart would flutter with excitement like a child embarking on a great adventure in a playground, for that was the level of how thrilled I was to be in the spectacular place. I would glide across the cushioned plush red carpet towards the oak shelves, my fingers trembling with excitement as I opened the crisp white pages and read the dark print. I loved the sweet musky smell of the paper and the ink, which is called bibliosomia, and I would settle on a velvety couch, my body sinking back into its soft cushioning, and I would read and read and read, forgetting about the time, forgetting where I was, forgetting absolutely everything. For me it was like being on a spinning wheel and whirling away from this world, flying above the clouds into other realms, dimensions and realities. It was an escapism at its finest, time travel, exploration and adventure at the speed of an author's words. The best thing of all is you didn't need a time-travelling machine or expensive plane tickets to visit these exotic, fabulous places. Indeed, all you needed was to leave the confines of the bookshop to accomplish this extraordinary feat with just words. For me, it was the epitome of true magic. Of course, when my mother couldn't find me in the main street, she invariably knew exactly where I was and would sigh with frustration. I would be discovered buried in a recliner at the old bookshop, and she would rescue me there, her pink face flustered with embarrassment. "Oh, there you are, Jamie. I wondered where you got to," she'd scold. "I thought I asked you to buy me a baker's dozen. I didn't ask you to come and read all these books. I might have known you would be here." She would then go through the motions of apologising to Mr. Wright on my behalf. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Wright. When Jamie gets embroiled in one of your books, it seems that wild horses will not drag him away from his reading, let alone his own mother," she said, raising a sarcastic eyebrow and releasing an annoying sigh to express her extreme angst and indignation. She would grab my book from me and hand it over the counter to Mr. Wright for purchase, fiddling around in her purse for the correct change, while Mr. Wright would ring out my book on his cash register and place it into a brown paper packet with the shop logo printed on its front, along with a picture of a brown owl wearing glasses and looking decidedly clever. I think she felt dutifully obligated to buying the book that I was reading, as in her opinion you never just sampled something and then replaced it on the shelf, as that was unethical and unprincipled for her. She likened reading a book and putting it back as like biting an apple at the greengrocer's and throwing it into the drum for somebody else to buy. Mr. Wright would smile warmly as he handed me my exciting package from across the counter, and he would say, "Well, that's the idea of the wizened friend. It's the quintessential place for you to get lost in the wonderful world of words and of thoughts. Your son understands and appreciates the full meaning of my shop." How I loved that bookshop, and over the years I became comfortable with the wizened friend, along with Mr. Wright, whom became like a fixture and fitting in the place, while I grew into one of his most loyal and regular customers. Main Street in our quaint little North American town was set against a backdrop of rugged countryside, exquisite mountainous views, and ubiquitous areas of natural forest. Our family home was about a 15-minute cycle ride from the town down some of those rather rocky dirt roads, and was a trip I would take very regularly, as sneaking to the bookshop became a customary event for me. Our typical farmhouse was a simplistic design, a symmetrical wooden double-storey building with sage green shutters and windows and a grey slate roof that contrasted superbly against the white panelled walls. We lived on a few acres of land, surrounded by acres of rolling verdant countryside, and it was a reasonable-sized property for our growing family. I had 3 younger sisters, but I was the oldest sibling in my family, and my parents' only son. One day when I was 18 years old, a large, sizable black Buick station wagon rolled down our driveway, and I could hear the crunching sound of the tyres squishing the pebbles beneath their thick rubber traction. Finally the car came to a screeching halt, and I glanced outside the kitchen window with an expression of extreme surprise on my face. What on earth was Mr. Wright's car doing parked outside our family home, I wondered. While we knew Mr. Wright from town, we weren't familiar with him or well acquainted with him on a social or personal level, that is. We ascertained that he did live alone, was reclusive, somewhat antisocial, and a man of few words, but a likeable, very pleasant and cordial gentleman, nevertheless. The dignified man was reputed to being a self-confessed bookaholic, and that didn't surprise me at all. It was rumoured that he read 1 book a day, but I could do that, so it wouldn't surprise me at all. I could hear the car door slam behind him, and the heavy tread of his shoes crunching the gravel beneath his feet, as he finally approached our sage-green front door, and then we heard the golden knocker rapping a few times. Our 2 jet-black Scottish terriers, Sooty and Midnight, were wagging their tails excitedly and barking in unison together, as my mother, still wearing her hair curlers and an avocado face mask, scurried to the front door to answer it. I could discern that she was somewhat caught off guard to see Mr. Wright standing there at the front doorstep, as her voice failed to conceal its element of surprise. "Oh, hello, Mr. Wright," I could hear her say. "Oh, please excuse my dreadful appearance. I didn't expect anybody to come over now. I could possibly scare the living dead in this grotesque face mask of mine. Now this is a lovely unexpected surprise. For what do I owe this wonderful pleasure?" "You look fine, if I may say so," said Mr. Wright very politely. "I'd like to speak to you and your son Jamie together, if I may. It is a matter of the utmost importance and urgency that requires your immediate and very prompt attention." "Please come through," said my mother, gesturing Mr. Wright to the living area and indicating for the man to take a seat on the recliner. "You stay there," she said, raising her hand in a stop signal, rather like you see at a pedestrian crossing. "I just need to wash off this face mask quickly, rustle up some tea for the both of you, and call Jamie." "That would be very lovely," said Mr. Wright. "I'll be waiting for you right here, and don't rush on my account. I'm a very patient man." Before long I was seated in a large recliner opposite Mr. Wright, while my mother began to pour cups of tea into teacups, and she was rather clumsy in this manner of protocol, as the teacups rattled precariously in her hands. "How do you like your tea, Mr. Wright?" she asked. "White with no sugar would be very, very nice," he said. She poured him his tea and handed it over to him, her fingers seemingly rather unsteady. As we began to sip the hot, steamy beverage, my mother and I pinned our eyes on Mr. Wright expectantly, waiting for him to take the lead in the conversation. I noticed his fingers wobbled as he placed down his teacup on the side table and peered at us both earnestly through his round spectacles, with a look of grave concern upon his face. "I am dying," he announced. "It's a very advanced form of prostate cancer, I'm afraid. I haven't got much time left," he said. "Maybe days, weeks, or possibly months," he shrugged. "Who knows?" At this point my mother's mouth opened, and she gawked at Mr. Wright in astonishment, seemingly surprised that a man of his reticence would divulge such personal information to us about himself. "Oh, my gosh! I'm so sorry, Mr. Wright. That's dreadful, dreadful news. I don't honestly know what on earth to say. Is there nothing that they can do for you? Like chemotherapy, radiation? You know that. All those kind of things." "It's too late for all of that," said Mr. Wright, shrugging his shoulders with an air of indifference. "The way I see it, Mrs. Anderson, when it's your time to go, it's your time." Oh dear, said my mother, tuttering away. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Wright. If there's anything that we can do, please don't hesitate to ask." "Well, there is something you can do, actually," he said, his eyes now homing in on me. "Well, it all depends on what your son Jamie has to say about my proposition." "Jamie," said my mother, looking flummoxed. Why would this concern him, Mr. Wright?" "It concerns him greatly," said Mr. Wright. "Your son rather reminds me of myself when I was his age. He has a fervent passion for books. I wonder," he said, looking at me directly, "if you would consider carrying on with my legacy by being the next owner of the Wizened Friend. I know it's a lot to think about, and to consider, of course, but I'd like you to think about it. Because when I'm gone, I would like that bookshop to still remain open in Main Street for as long as possible. And I would like to think of it being run by someone who loves books as much as you do." "Mr. Wright," said my mother, looking awkward, "I don't think we could afford to buy your bookshop, even if we wanted to. And this is Jamie's future we're talking about. While he loves books, I'm sure, I'm not quite certain that his aspirations are aligned towards owning a bookshop. Maybe he wants to do something else with his life." "Ah, well, that's why I'm here. I'd like to sign over my estate to your son, if I may, if of course he's in agreement with my proposal. I have no intention of asking you to buy the shop, of course, but if your son can assure me that running the bookshop in Main Street would be something that he could envisage for his future in the short term, Then I would feel secure in the knowledge that the wizened friend is in the best of hands, and that will rest very well with my heart most happily. It was my turn to look befuddled and thrilled, as this was all my dreams coming to fulfilment at once. I couldn't think of anything in the world I'd rather do than run my own bookshop, especially the wizened friend. I'd never thought about owning a bookshop before. The idea hadn't even crossed my mind, but the thought of spending every day surrounded by books was quite simply my idea of heaven. "Mr. Wright! Mr. Wright!" I said, my eyes sparkling with excitement and my face lighting up in a joyous, gleeful expression. "I'd love to be the next owner of the wizened friend. It would be a dream come true for me. I've never thought of owning a bookshop before, but thinking about it now, I couldn't think of anything I'd really love better. I'm in shock. It's so generous of you to do this kind thing for me. I don't really know what to say." "I thought as much," said Mr. Wright. "I had no doubt in my mind that that would be your answer, and it's only a pleasure to leave the wizened friend in such agreeable hands. From the moment you walked into my bookshop with your wide, excited eyes, I knew you were the one to carry on the legacy. I'll teach you all the ropes on how to run the place before I finally pop my clogs," he joked. And he was true to his word, and taught me everything I needed to know about seamlessly running a bookshop, and in those weeks I realised I had truly discovered my calling. And so it was at the young tender age of a mere 18, to the envy of all my friends, I was running my own bookshop in Main Street, after poor Mr. Wright had finally died on July the 4th of 1982. I made absolutely sure that to honour his legacy and his memory, that the wizened friend became the most beguiling shop in Main Street, and I certainly achieved that aim. I would even leave the shop doors open when the whole town was snowed in, and people were trapped in their homes due to the bad weather. It was at times like this when all the other shops in Main Street were invariably closed, except the wizened friend. Anyone who fancied a trip to town on the back of their snowmobile, or wearing a hardy pair of snowshoes, could always pop into my shop to buy a book, and the irony is that they often did, because there is nothing better than reading a book in freezing weather by a crackling warm fire. I would light up the wood-burning stove in the shop, and offer my customers warm cups of hot cocoa, and I would sleep in the back room there, where I possessed my own kitchenette with an old-fashioned stove and refrigerator, along with a cosy bed, so it wasn't uncommon for me to sleep overnight at the wizened friend, which I occasionally did. Fast forward to when I was about 22 years old, and during the middle of the day the sun just disappeared behind a grey, gloomy, overcast sky, and a vast frosty stillness fell over the town, as the bleak Siberian winter weather had taken a circumpolar, rather nasty turn, and the snow began falling down heavily, like white feathers descending from the heavenlies, swathing the world in a thick, luxurious carpet of exquisite white snow. I would light up the wood-burning stove in the shop, to make it delightfully warm, cosy and welcoming, and offer my customers lovely hot cups of cocoa, and I would sleep in the back room there, where I possessed my own lovely kitchenette, with an old-fashioned stove and refrigerator, along with a cosy bed, so it wasn't uncommon for me to sleep over at the wizened friend, and I often did. Fast forward to when I was about 22 years old, and during the middle of the day, the sun just disappeared behind a grey, gloomy, overcast sky, and a vast, frosty stillness fell over the town, as the bleak Siberian winter weather had taken a circumpolar, rather nasty turn. The snow began falling down heavily, like white feathers descending from the heavenlies, swathing the world in a thick, luxurious carpet of exquisite white snow, blanketing the ponderosa pines and Douglas firs, transforming them into fragile, delicate and ethereal trees that spoke of white Christmases, stockings hanging on the hearth, warm mulled wine, mince pies, and delicious frothy glasses of eggnog. The bell of my shop tinkled as the young woman entered it with her woolly hat covering her ears and her body shaking with the cold. "Hello, Mrs. Brown," I said. "It's freezing out there. What are you doing in town right now? Aren't all the shops closed yet? You shouldn't be out in this blistering cold weather. You'll catch your death of cold." "Well, the baker's only just closed his doors right now," said Mrs. Brown. I couldn't leave town without buying his delicious cinnamon buns, because they're so delectable, just out of the oven, served piping hot. I thought I'd pop in to buy a book to keep me busy at home, she said, as I fancy sitting by a cosy fire, reading while we're snowed in like this. Oh, it's so lovely and warm in here, she said, making a quick dart towards the wood-burning stove and warming her hands against the glass panel that reflected the bright yellow flames of the crackling fire on its inside grate. You better be careful, Jamie. If you make this bookshop of yours any more cosier, no one will ever want to leave it. It's as warm as toast in here. I think I might just move in, she teased. That's the whole idea, I said, smiling at my customer warmly. Can I brew you a nice warm cup of hot chocolate? Now you're talking, she said, as she began to study the lines of books along the shelves. Now the big question is, what do I want to read? A detective, a mystery, or a romance novel? I can't quite decide. In a short period of time, 3 more people had gathered in my cosy bookshop, inspired by exactly the same idea as Mrs. Brown, about buying books to read by the fire. So they piled in my shop to get warm, drink some hot chocolate, and select a book that they fancied to read. So it seemed like the feisty, spirited winter conditions were not having any adverse impact on my business. On the contrary, the reverse was true. Finally, at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I closed my doors and sat by the wood-burning stove, reclining comfortably in the springy sofa, allowing its sumptuous cushioning to bolster me up, whilst I was swaddled under the cosy warmth of a white fluffy blanket, with the shop cat Tabitha curled up snugly on my lap. One day she just swaggered into my shop with an air of authority, almost as if she owned the place. I remember she jumped on the settee, making herself feel very comfortable, and her long, sleek grey body curling up contentedly by the cosy fire. From thenceforth she moved into the shop, revelling in the attention of admiring, adoring customers who would swoon around her, saying, "Oh, she's so beautiful! Oh, my word! What a delightful cat you have!" The trouble was that Tabitha knew she was beautiful, and there were many times she would sit on the bathroom counter staring in wondrous awe at her reflection, as truly her vanity knew no bounds. She certainly thrived on all the perks I bestowed on her, like cooked chicken and fresh salmon. I truly think she thought she ran the wizened friend, and I was her butler waiting on her hand and foot. I admit I couldn't help myself from spoiling her rotten, and besides, she had so quickly and seamlessly become a big attraction to the store, and a quintessential asset to the shop, and I'm sure, in a subconscious way, she played her part in increasing the sales figures. I must confess the constant spoiling had indeed upholstered her anatomy quite significantly, making her irresistibly cuddly, and even more endearing to her flocking admirers that were growing steadily by the day into a sizable fan club. People were much more inclined to ask after her than inquire about me. I was intent on staying overnight at the shop on this particular occasion, while the heavy snow and winter conditions continued outside. I would open my doors in the morning, I thought, to those brave, bold and audacious enough to endure the cutting, benumbed elements. I was finding the winter weather tended to permeate all my outdoor clothes with a potent iciness that was so cold it actually burnt. I could hear the howling winds escalate and increase in magnitude outside the confines of my shop. When you've surrounded yourself with a warm, cosy fire and very agreeable creature comforts, it can be oddly gratifying, cheering and consolatory listening to the wind outside, as you are so safely contained in your cosy little bubble, while the world outside your cushioned secure space is in turbulent upheaval. I could hear the raucous, vacillating wind roaring and dropping in frequency to a gentle whispering sound, whilst the exterior panel of glass to my shop rattled and quaked, creating a clamorous jolting that was somewhat unsettling. I was very glad indeed not to be caught up in the midst of this unpleasant blizzard. A gentle, ethereal light remained on in the wizened friend all night, and in the throes of reading my novel, sleep finally overcame me. My eyes gently rolled shut, like the blinders on a window. The lids relaxed, and the contours of my face significantly loosened, as I drifted off into the engaging world of my dreams. I was awoken to a strange, rather peculiar rattling sound that I couldn't quite identify, but I assumed it was the wailing wind stepping up its motion. I glanced briefly at my watch. Goodness, I thought, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. I must have fallen asleep while I was reading. I realised that Tabitha had long since left her comfortable sleeping spot, and was now standing only yards away from the shop window, her yellow-green eyes looking fixedly at something. Even her long coat of grey hair had literally doubled in its size and was standing up on edge, and her tail was thrashing up and down violently like a rider's whip, whilst her ears were pinned back. I could hear a very strange, rather peculiar sound emanating from the back of her throat that sounded like a growl, a hiss or a snarl, followed by a long drawn-out meow. It was clear she could see something that my eyes had missed, and whatever it was causing her a measure of distress. In a trice I instinctively moved towards the window to see what it was that had upset her. Then I saw it. It was a dark, shadowy figure, a massive silhouette of a Herculean-sized human form covered in hair, with a large leathery face pinned against the window, the large flat nose smudging the glass. Whatever it was, it appeared exceedingly curious, possibly drawn to the inside pearly light that illuminated the entire shop in a subtle and pretty luminescence, and it was obviously inquisitively looking into the shop window for a closer inspection. All of a sudden its eyes met mine, and he held my gaze for a second, no more than a fleeting second, of course, and then he began to glide away. I don't know what I was actually thinking, for indeed I doubt I engaged any thoughts at all, but I did react as I would have done with anyone showing an interest in my bookshop. I quickly grabbed my coat, throwing it over my shoulders, and hurriedly slipped on my snowshoes, whilst attaching my headlight to my head and opening the shop door to brave the sub-zero glacial weather conditions and the blistering wind that was blowing against my face, whilst I ran after the strange, unfamiliar creature. It was like any common sense had eluded me, and I wasn't sure what I was doing, but I ran after the mysterious stranger without even an ounce of trepidation, and looking back, I often wonder why. I glanced down at the long trail of oversized footprints that were deeply entrenched in the snow, and was completely astounded by the size of these things. They trailed down the street towards the back of the shop, over a long field towards the woodgrove that fringed the rear of the shops on Main Street. Of course, the forest no longer exists there today, as the trees were eventually bulldozed to create more shops in the area, but when I was young, those forests stretched back for many miles. I bolted after the creature, increasing my speed somewhat. Whatever it was, it appeared to be in no hurry, and although it was taking its time to walk casually towards the woods, while it was swinging its arms backwards and forwards, its stride was equivalent to about 5 of my feet. As I ran in the thick snow, I slowed down my pace significantly, while the icy blizzards of wind thundered brutally against my face, stinging my skin like a sandstorm. But I remain unfazed. Nothing could suppress my eager enthusiasm to observe this strange creature, for I knew in my gut that I might never encounter it again, and I had a huge fascination for the unexplained and the mysterious. I was breathing rapidly, my heart thumping in my ears, as I finally caught up to the creature. I think I was possibly about 2 feet behind him, and he possibly hadn't heard me, as the punnelling wind was a noisy distraction that certainly subdued the squeaking sound of my boots, silencing my quiet and cautious approach. All of a sudden the creature sniffed the air, as if he could discern my scent, and then slowly he stopped on his tracks and turned around, swivelling his huge upper torso to look directly at me. And when he saw me, his facial expression was one of total and utter bewilderment. He was surprised that I'd been foolish enough to stalk him, and surprised that he hadn't heard my feeble approach. I think the element of surprise was certainly my greatest advantage, for this creature was not quite sure how to react to me. I discerned the furrows or train tracks, if you like, on the creature's forehead, deepened in intensity, into what I can only describe as a puzzled, perturbed expression, with an almost a look of "What do you want?" written on his face. I wasn't prepared for what I was seeing, and I have no idea what I was actually expecting to see. But this tall and ample-sized creature was most certainly built like a monstrous giant, towering at about 9 foot tall and easily over 700 pounds and 4 feet wide across the shoulder area. Nothing, and I mean nothing, prepares you for facing a creature of such monstrous size that is built with such powerful muscular density that would intimidate even a large predator. This creature's Herculean barrel-sized body was bounteously swathed in a luxurious thick coat of jet-black hair that contrasted so dramatically and dynamically against the stark whiteness of the snow. I could see him clearly in the light of my headlamp. In my opinion, his face was so human, as was the physical alignment of his entire body, with of course the exception of his overlong arms and his pyramid-shaped head. It was in that moment when the creature's eyes met mine that I realised with horror that I'd run towards an apex predator, rather like a mouse to a tabby cat, almost as if I was offering myself on a dinner plate for him. In a trice, my heart jumped into my throat and began beating violently in my ears, while chills of dread ran down my spine. To my amazement, the creature appeared totally non-aggressive, and rolled up a piece of snow in front of my eyes, barely bending his knees in the process due to the length of his arms. The creature appeared to chuckle as he threw the snowball at me, with a teasing, playful look in his eyes that challenged me. I was shocked, completely and totally shocked. He actually wanted to play with me. Perhaps he'd seen children throwing snowballs together, I thought, for the long field behind the shops of Main Street was often used by the youngsters to throw snowballs at each other in the winter months and to have snowman competitions. I was certain that the creature had been eyewitness to these games, possibly having observed them as a youngling and longing to take part in the fun and games for himself. Now was his chance, I thought, rolling up a snowball and throwing it at him. Before long we were having the time of our lives, throwing snowballs at each other, and the snowball fight of my life. But the creature increased the fun of the games by indicating where I should aim the ball. He pointed towards his elbow, but I missed over and over again. But when I pointed to an area on my body for the creature to throw the snowball at, he hit the bullseye every single time, as his hand-to-eye coordination was completely astonishing. Suddenly, standing there in the tree line of the Douglas firs that fringed the edges of the forest, I discerned a tall, solitary figure watching us. When the creature that was playing with me saw the strange creature standing there silently observing us, he looked like a little boy who'd been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, and without looking at me, he glided hurriedly towards the figure. And this creature began to talk to him fast, backwards and forwards, in a language that sounded like Cantonese, and the tone of her voice reminded me of a belligerent headmistress, and I say her because the voice sounded female. I think the creature was getting into trouble for playing games with me, and it's a distinct possibility, as I never ever got to see him again, which I seriously regret. All this happened a very long time ago, and the creature I encountered in the early hours of the morning was without doubt a male Bigfoot, with a youthful energy, and to date the snowball game with that Bigfoot has never ever been trumped by anybody else. For many long years I ran the Wise and Friend Bookshop, which were among the best years of my life, thanks to Mr. Wright. But after a bad motorcycle accident upon which I lost one of my legs, I was unable to reopen the shop. But to this very day, I believe running that bookshop was my greatest life calling. But now I'm on a different journey, but books of every kind are still my biggest passion. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my friends considered me to be a do-gooder, a people-pleaser, someone that never actually stepped out of line, as I always did the right thing, like courteously helping the little old lady struggling to cross the street with her heavy shopping bags laden with groceries, or opening a car door for a lady, whether it be my mother or the girl across the road. I performed these gentlemanly, gallant acts of chivalry as naturally as breathing, possibly because I was raised by two very well-bred, obsequious parents who were determined to make a polished gentleman out of me yet. It would seem that the influences of my father's staunchly old-fashioned values had indeed rubbed off on me significantly, profoundly impacting my life. He perceived that badly behaved children were a result of very bad parenting, and while that may be partially true, there are children that are naturally delinquent and rebellious by nature, through no fault of their parents. I was the quiet, introverted one, both at my school and in my home. I was always reserved, unassuming, and exceedingly polite. My grades were excellent, so I was always a firm favourite with all the teachers, acquiring an unblemished record. Yet I unequivocally despised my squeaky clean reputation, which gave people the false impression that I was pedestrian, boring, prosaic, and unquestionably monochromatic. Furthermore, I didn't relish my humiliating and degrading distinction of being the teacher's pet. I noticed the boys in school with a reputation for being bad asses and daredevils, so to speak, were the ones that attracted all the pretty girls. To be fair, they weren't afraid to step out of line. They were ardent liars who would swear blindly like sailors, smoke in the corridors, and prank all the teachers. In their world, being polite just didn't exist, and they delighted on living on the edge, taking risks and bunking off school at every given opportunity. These were the boys that exasperated the teachers, maddening their parents. I, on the other hand, found myself incapable of doing anything that involved being reckless and irresponsible. I so envied the boys in my class that weren't bridled by rigid discipline, but were carefree enough to do as they pleased like wild horses in the meadows. Why could I not be like that, I would wonder? Why could I not let go of the bit between my mouth, and like an unrestrained wild horse gallop into the sunset, tossing my glorious silky mane of dark hair? Fortunately, I was popular in school, but I was teased relentlessly for being such a grade A student and a model son, a preeminent acclaim that I was eager to shed like the skin off a snake. Who in their right mind is going to go for the bland vanilla flavour when there are much more exciting choices on offer? Tatiana Granger had long strawberry blonde hair, blue eyes and fair skin, and everything about her appearance bedazzled me. But she only had eyes for the bad boys, which was my rotten luck. I really liked Tatiana, I confided to Pia one day, but she's not remotely interested in me. And she never will be, bro piped Pia. You're not an adventurous and exciting enough boy for her. You're too prim and proper. I think I'm blindly aware of that, I admitted. At least my parents approve of my boring predictability, I teased. At that, Pia dropped a bombshell. I think my parents wish I'd never been born, he told me, with a distinct resentment in his voice. My father says I'm driving him to an early grave, as I cause him so much stress. My mother reckons I'm the reason she's addicted to cigarettes, because smoking calms her down. I'm sure that's not true, I said. You probably just wind them up. But all that stuff about wishing you weren't born, that's made up in your own head, bro. I think parents can't help themselves from loving their own children, irrespective of how annoying they may be. It kind of goes with the territory of being a parent. Maybe you're right, said Pia. But I know my mother would kill to have a son like you. I'm always lying to them, and it drives them completely potty. I wish I could be more like you, responsible, reliable, and completely truthful. Really, I said, raising a cynical eyebrow. I doubt you really do. I'd never have the guts to do some of the things you do, and I seriously wish I did. I'm boringly reliable. Robin, who'd been listening in to our conversation intently, suddenly had a bright and brilliant idea. If you really mean what you say, Cole, he said, turning to me, I have an awesome idea. I say, are you two boys up to doing a dare that goes against your character? Something that goes beyond your comfort zone? He asked the both of us. Well, I'm up for it, said Pia. Why, what do you want me to do? He asked. Try and be like Cole here for an entire week. Open car doors for ladies. Respect your parents. Be honest, diplomatic, tactful and all that stuff. Do you think you can even do it? For a whole week, said Pia, groaning. Now that is a big deal, bro, he said, rubbing his chin reflectively. Okay, I'll do it, he said, but it's going to be hard. I'm not going to lie, but I'm up for the challenge. I guess my parents aren't going to recognise the new me, the new improved version of myself, he joked. And how about you, Cole? Said Robin, looking at me intently with his spirited brown eyes. On Saturday night, I want you to break into Mr. Neville Hartfield's home. You think you can do it without getting cold feet? Are you joking, I said. That's a criminal offence. It's against the law. I can't possibly do that. You're crazy. You're asking way too much of me. I wasn't expecting a dare like that. As I expected. You're too much of a wuss. You're as spineless as an earthworm, piped Robin. Go on, be a sport. Show us what you're really made of. It's not that I don't want to do it, I protested. I'm not comfortable in breaking into somebody else's home. It's not even a question of breaking the law. It's morally and ethically wrong. It's an invasion of someone's privacy and personal space. It's not right." "It's a dare," said Robin. "That's what it is. And how can it be an invasion of his space when Neville will never even know you were there? You will leave the place exactly as you found it. I'm making it very easy for you, Cole. It's just a game. That's all it is. It's a dare. Neville always has that barless window at the rear of the property wide open for that morbidly obese ginger cat of his to access. I gather it got its midriff jammed in the cat flap once, so the fire brigade had to be called in order to evacuate the cat safely. I know because I had coffee there with my father once and couldn't help commenting on the barless open window. So you can squeeze through it without any trouble. I know he's out every Saturday night with friends, so he'll never even know that you snuck into his house. You won't get caught. So are you up to this dare or not? Or are you going to remain a complete wet blanket and wimp out?" All right, I'll do it then," I groaned reluctantly. "But I want you to know I'm not happy about this at all. I'm not happy about it at all. But I draw the line at taking anything. I cannot do that because I'm not a thief, and I'm only going to go because he's out on Saturday night. Otherwise, forget it." "Fair enough," said Robin excitedly. "I'm thrilled to see you do this. You've gone up in my estimation, Cole, a whole lot, bro. I'm proud of you." It was formally decided that the dares would take place at about 8 p.m. on a Saturday night, by which time the foul-mouthed, belligerent peer was to magically transform himself from a truculent, pugnacious and bad-tempered teenager into a model son and student for an entire week, until 8 p.m. the following Saturday, after which he could be as nasty as he wanted to be. I must admit I found it exceedingly difficult believing that the Bolshie peer, who was as turbulent and changeable as the seasonal weather, often blowing hot and cold during the day like an easterly wind, with a musical sequence of fluctuating mood swings, could actually last for an entire week, being genuinely nice to his parents, let alone his friends and teachers. I truly didn't think he could do it, but I did detect a very admirable steely grit and determination on his part, and as for him losing, that didn't appear to be an option or a choice. As you can imagine, I was dreading Saturday night. Everyone in town knew Neville Hartfield, who was a relatively attractive man, quite tall and slender in his early 30s, cleanly shaven with a thatch of straw-coloured hair, high cheekbones and bright blue eyes. He lived on his own and was recently divorced from his ex-wife Sally. That was all I actually knew about him, although I had seen him before shopping in the local town. Neville's house was the large traditional double-storey home at the end of our street. Its exterior wooden panels were painted in a beguiling ethereal pearly blue colour, with a straight line of arched and painted white panel windows on the lower elevation and square ones on the upper storey, with a contrasting pale grey slate roof and a vintage red front door. Neville's front yard aligned with all the other symmetrical houses in the street in perfect synchronicity, whilst his emerald green yard was meticulously mown, complemented by a charming, rather quaint cobbled pathway that meandered to the front door in a curvaceous curve and was so elegantly fringed by a pretty arrangement of manicured lollipop trees. On the rather grandiose sweeping approach to the front door were several large stone steps that were framed on either side by a decorative ornate grouping of white pots that were bursting with colourful blooms. The sprawling turf-lined pavement was a seamless extension of his open front yard, with its perfect congruence of red maple trees that elegantly fringed the sides of the wide tarmacked road in a statuesque display which was particularly sensational in autumn when the leaves turned a stunning exquisite red colour. It was an attractive part of South Carolina, in close proximity to the local town, and also to the stunningly beautiful Misty Moon Woodgrove, which was a wooded area or sanctuary, if you like, where people would walk their dogs or go hiking or cycling, and although that was not the established name, that was what we called it back then. It was Saturday night when our plans for the designated dare came to fruition, and 4 of my friends came to collect me at the front door of my pale cream symmetrical home, with its vintage red roof, matching shutters, red-framed wooden windows and doors. We all trekked down the road attired in our trendy blue denim jeans, sweaters and bomber jackets. There was a biting chill in the air that permeated our outer garments, causing us to shiver quite significantly. But we didn't even bat an eyelid. We ambled with a deliberate sense of purpose across the verdant neighbourhood and the aureate, brightly lit homes, where we could smell the burning embers of wood and coal, as the residents in our neighbourhood were clearly enjoying warm fires in their homes on this night. Finally, with the stealthful cautiousness of a mountain lion, we crept deliberately towards the house that belonged to Neville. Without question, this night could easily have been confused with any other Saturday night during the week, as walking to town was a regular event. We enjoyed drinking creamy Don Pedros and indulging in plates of piping hot chips covered in gravy and melted cheese at the local diner, which was all the rage in the 80s. I enjoyed walking at night while listening to the sounds of frogs and crickets and glancing up at the Milky Way, appreciating the white ivory luminescence of a half moon along with the twinkling brilliance of the silvery stars. I could detect an excitable energy in the air that was silently exuded by all of my friends, a couple of whom had secretly placed personal wagers that I would chicken out of my dare at the very last minute. It was the image of Tatiana Granger in my head, admiring the newly resurrected badass in me, that lifted me out of my comfort zone and inspired me to take on this challenge. If I did this for anyone, it would be for her. It was my way of proving to myself that I could indeed be adventurous and daring after all. One by one, all 5 of us crept towards the backyard, while my friends watched me squeeze through the kitchen window at the rear of the property, which wasn't difficult to accomplish at all. I found myself on the hard granite kitchen counter and lowered myself awkwardly onto the flagstone floor beneath. My task was to go up the stairs, switch on a couple of lights in Neville's bedroom, and then leave the premises forthwith through the kitchen window once again. It seemed almost pathetically straightforward, and far too easy, but I wasn't going to say anything. That was until I could hear the low-pitched drone of car wheels crunching the gravel beneath thick rubber tyres and finally screeching and grinding to a halt as it parked under the carport. I realised in horror and great trepidation that Neville had returned home, and I began to panic. My heart thundered in my ears and dreadful chills ran down my spine, whilst a bitter taste of nausea glided across the back of my throat, making me feel suddenly very queasy. Oh my God, I thought, he's coming, he's coming, hide, hide! A car door slammed, the automatic locking system clicked and engaged, while light feet darted up the stone steps, and the key twisted, turned and clicked in the lock, opening the front door. The front door creaked open slowly, allowing blasts of icy wind to envelop the house. Then I heard the footsteps, this time with a heavy tread, gliding hurriedly up the staircase, getting ever closer and closer, until they ambled boldly into the main bedroom, where a closet door was hurriedly opened, whilst the hinges also creaked, and then a thumping sound was heard, almost as if Neville was digging around in a jacket pocket, ferreting around for something. "Ah, there you are," he said, talking to himself. I was lying squeezed under the queen-sized bed, my torso pressing against the pristine, immaculate cream carpet, and my heart thundering vigorously in my chest. I could hear Neville was slightly out of breath as he was breathing very fast. I had a spectacular view of the rather zooty tan loafers he was wearing that paced up and down his pristine white carpet as he eagerly dialed a number in on his cordless phone. My heart sank when his rotund, portly ginger cat, Tubbs, could be heard outside the bedroom with his neck bell tinkling. He appeared to be grooming himself. I knew the podgy cat exceedingly well. He was so broad in the beam, so much so that his undercarriage rubbed against the ground whenever he walked. I was pondering on these thoughts when Tubbs wobbled and jiggled into the bedroom, while his head swiveled around in my direction, and his rounded yellow eyes were pinned in directly on me. "Oh no," I thought, "the bloody cat has seen me." Tubbs appeared to twist his body, backing towards me, elevating his puffy tail, whilst emitting a fine spray that jetted over the edge of the bed and the sides of my face, spraying me with a vaporous, pungent, acidic mist. Perhaps Tubbs was not only laying claim to the queen-size bed that Neville owned, but to me as well. My face was now covered in the fine, dewy, but pervasive, acrid mist of Tubbs's urine. I could even discern the ghastly bitter taste of it on my tongue, and I desperately tried to suppress my desire to hurl, and believe me, that wasn't easy. "Don't do that, Tubbs," snapped Neville. "That's disgusting. Don't spray in the house. Go on, shoo, Tubbs, shoo." Tubbs did not listen, but rolled contentedly on the luxury carpet at the base of the bed, purring profusely, and lashing out at me playfully with his paws, as if toying with one of those long dangly toys. It seemed like I had become his soft toy or entertainment, so to speak, as one of his claws went slicing through my skin. I nearly yelped out in pain as the blood dribbled onto the cream carpet, staining it in a kaleidoscope of crimson droplets. Tubbs so nearly gave my hiding place away, but luckily Neville was too distracted and engaged to notice the strange antics of his playful cat. I heard him talking on the telephone to someone. "No, I'm back home. Yes, that's right. Can you believe it? I forgot my damn wallet behind. I'll be with you in a second. Make sure you order me the Hawaiian. You know the one, with the extra chili sauce. Yes, that's right. That will do very nicely, along with a large portion of onion rings. Great. Absolutely. That'll be fine. We'll see you in a moment, then." As you can imagine, relief overwhelmed me when Neville finally bounded down the stairs again, rather like an excitable dog. He slammed the front door behind him and dashed back to his dark Cadillac. Finally, I could hear the low-pitched droning sound of his car as Neville drove away into the night. Phew, that was close, I thought, sighing with relief as I wiggled out from under the bed. By this time, Tubbs was rubbing his paunchy body affectionately against my legs, purring madly and almost demanding my attention. So I did relent and I stroked him for a few minutes, and he couldn't get enough of being fussed over. I could see the closet door was lying partially open, and something was sticking up from inside the door that besought my scrutiny, and I placed on the bedroom light eagerly to observe it more clearly, as my curiosity was now kindled. My blood froze over, and a creepy shudder trickled down my spine like icy droplets of water. On the white cardboard was a colourful collage of photographs, all of a man that I recognised who lived in our street. His name was Ralph Mead. It was stuck to the inside door like an amateur work of art. The photographs had been sneakily taken when Ralph was drinking latte at a coffee shop or mowing his front yard. It was all decidedly odd, and all these photographs bordered on a fanatical obsession. Was Neville a closet gay, I wondered, with a passionate fixation and lustful hankering for this Ralph Mead character? Surely that was rather unlikely. Ralph was 10 years his senior, and he was also overweight with a bulbous stomach and a bright red crimson face, along with the tiniest piggy eyes you've ever seen, that really rather reminded me of a hippo. Why would his passions be inflamed by a man like this, and not a super stud with a washboard torso and Iron Man biceps? It didn't make any sense at all. Ralph Mead didn't even win any awards for personality either. He wasn't exactly the life and soul of the party. On the contrary, he was the dullest, most boring person in our town. He was a swimming pool salesman and would talk about nothing else apart from chlorine and the pH of your pool. I had always got the impression that Neville was very straight and heterosexual, yet I knew appearances could be deceptive, and many people's lives were often cloaked in secrecy. Yet I couldn't help thinking it was very sick to be surreptitiously stalking someone that you fancied like this, unbeknown to them. Instinctively I randomly opened the opposite side of the closet door, and what I saw turned my insides to jelly. There was a white piece of cardboard attached to the other door, which read, "Ralph Mead must die. Number 1, make it look like an accident, drowning, animal attack, carbon monoxide, poisonous mushrooms," and the list went on and on. I didn't read any more. I felt completely sick to my stomach, for I could not unsee what I had seen. Worse still, I couldn't tell anybody about this, because it would mean I was guilty of breaking and entering into someone's property. My lips had to remain sealed. I'm not going to pretend that I was not untroubled by what I'd observed. "Well done," my friends chorused with delight when I finally shimmied my way out of Neville's kitchen window. "We told you you could do it. Mind you, that was too close for comfort. It was touch and go for a moment. We never anticipated Neville coming back in his car like that. We all hid behind the large bramble bush, but we were rather concerned you would get caught up in the house." "No chance," I said. "Ye of little faith," I teased. "If you must know, I made a plan and quickly hid under his bed with an excellent view of Neville's shoes and the ginger tabby that nearly gave the game away, as he started attacking me with his paws under the bed as some kind of a game. It certainly was a close call, I'll give you that." After our dare, We drove into town and went to our favourite diner for hamburgers and Don Pedro's, but it was later in the evening in a nonchalant, carefree way I randomly piped. "Talking about Neville, a little birdie told me that he dislikes that man. What's his name? Oh, Ralph Mead." Pierre looked at me in surprise. "You mean you don't know about Ralph Mead?" he asked, looking rather appalled. "Know what?" I asked. "Cole's family only moved here 2 years ago," Robin reminded my friends. "He wouldn't know about the case." "Of course, that's right. You didn't live in our neighbourhood then," said Pierre. "Well, Neville and his wife lived in that pretty blue house together, the one you broke into tonight. By all accounts, they had a very happy marriage, and soon afterwards they both had a baby boy called Michael. He was a cute little toddler, but one day Ralph Mead bolted down Neville's driveway at a very fast speed. He was visiting them to show them how to manage the algae in their pool. Unfortunately, he ran over their toddler in the driveway, killing him instantly. It was a devastating incident that upset the entire town. It's not easy when a child dies." "You're kidding," I said. "That's terrible. Did Ralph get into trouble with the law?" "Not exactly," said Pierre. "Ralph Mead's parents are very loaded. They paid for only the best lawyers for him, and I think he got a charge of accidental death, and only did a little community service, which was very distressing for poor Neville. He believed that Ralph had murdered his little child. So there's no love lost between the two of them now. Neville blames Ralph for destroying his life, and he's expressed as much when he gets Tiddly at the bar. I think it was the devastating impact of losing their toddler that caused their marital relationship to fall apart and irretrievably break down. I gather his ex-wife is now remarried, and she has another son that is the splitting image of baby Michael, and its mannerisms are almost identical. The mother swears the kid is the reincarnation of little Michael. It's all rather weird, but the resemblance is rather uncanny. Almost chilling, really." "Wow, that is an extraordinary story," I said. "It can't be easy for Neville to live in the same town as Ralph Mead, the very man that ran over his toddler. I imagine his blood must boil over every time he sees the man." "Well, it stands to reason, doesn't it?" said Pierre. "But neither of them appear to want to move away from the town." A week after the dare, it was time to catch up with Pierre. Surprise, surprise for all of you. I actually overcame the dare. I didn't lose it once with either of my parents, hand on heart. At first, I admit it was a struggle to be nice to them, he told us, especially opening the car door for my mother. She nearly passed out and had a heart attack when I did that, and asked me if I was all right. Surprisingly enough, it actually felt good to be helpful. I was pleasantly surprised how much better the atmosphere in our home changed. My sister even told me that I'd been given a personality transplant because I was actually nice. My mother was so happy all week. I've never seen her like that before. She looked like the cat that had got the cream. I overheard her telling her friends that her toad of a son had transformed himself into a handsome prince. "Well done you," I said. It was around about this time when people in our small town were claiming to have strange encounters with a hairy humanoid that fit the description of a Bigfoot. Of course, I'd heard of the creature before, but in truth I believed it was a creature of pulp fiction and nothing more. The first person to have an encounter in our small town was an old lady called June Phillips, who was walking her Yorkshire Terrier, and the tiny little dog began yapping up at a tree on the walking trail. It was growling fiercely at it and wouldn't stop. By all accounts, it was quite a little spirited, feisty and sprightly dog. She tried to get the dog to move away, wondering why it was so fixated on that single tree, but it simply wouldn't stop yapping. All of a sudden, she saw a dark, shadowy form silently moving away and slipping from the tree trunk with a look of terror on its human-like face. "This thing," said June. "It was enormous. It was easily 7 foot tall and 3 foot wide. It was like a humanoid ape, covered in long, flowing, dark brown hair, dense with muscle. It began to glide away so gracefully, and little Pixie here," she said proudly, "ran after this thing so boldly. My little dog, he might be tiny, but he's as brave as a lion. That thing! That thing! It scared the living hell out of me. But Pixie? No, it wasn't frightened of him at all. Then there was Mark Weatherman, who went berry picking during the summer, and noticed a large figure sitting up in the grass, with its powerfully strong muscular back turned away from him, at 4 feet off the ground. It appeared to be eating berries, whilst basking in the glorious sunshine, staring out at the pretty view over the flowery meadow. Mark Weatherman was very close to the creature, but did not feel fear, only extreme fascination and intrigue. He knew instinctively by the powerful shape of the creature and its muscular density that this was no bear. He stood very still, and just stood there, his eyes locked onto the creature. After a few seconds, the creature then turned around and saw Mark just standing there. For a moment their eyes briefly met, and then the creature just got up on its haunches and glided away. The one thing that bowled me over was the sheer size of this thing. But this creature was so human and so intelligent. One Thursday night at about 10:30 in the evening, my mother and I were the next 2 people in our town to have a random sighting of the elusive creature known as Bigfoot. We were leaving my mother's sister's house to return home. My little cousin James, who was 10 at the time, had been struggling with his math homework, and my aunt had requested my services in giving him some math tuition. I enjoyed teaching him, as he was a very sweet boy, and he picked up on the math pretty quickly once it was explained to him properly. It became a regular event to give him math tuition every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, while my mother and her sister Patricia would go off shopping together and return home with pizza or Chinese food. Invariably it meant we would leave my aunt's house at about 10 o'clock at night, and by then it was quite dark outside. My mother always liked taking the back roads even at night on the return journey home, which was something that unsettled my father greatly, and I never actually understood. As in those days we didn't have access to cell phones, so if you got stuck in a pothole overnight, there was no way you could get out until a passing car came to your rescue. On this occasion my mother and I were chattering away, when she saw something very obscure and almost blurry, sitting in the middle of the dirt road. She stopped the car and closed the door behind her, darting towards the shadowy figure in the road, with me tagging behind her, not sure what we would actually find. We had a sinking feeling that something had been hurt or knocked over by a passing car, and was now slowly dying. We ventured towards the form, discerning a very sad whimpering sound that sounded like a young kid crying. My mother instinctively rushed over to the form, overcome with deep concern for this incongruous creature, even though she failed to know exactly what it was. I remember it looked exactly like a 10-year-old boy, but covered in long, flowing, thick hair. The creature was pointing at his foot, and was clearly in pain. My mother was examining the wide padded foot with curiosity. It was so well cushioned it was amazing that anything had penetrated the hardened, horny barrier, but it certainly had. When my mother started pulling the long stick out of the foot, the creature began to whimper with pain, and even tried to push her away with his hands, as if to say, "Stop, stop, it hurts." That was when I intervened and just grabbed the stick as hard as I could, pulling it out so fast before the creature could even react. I handed the offending thorn back to the creature, and he took it eagerly and began to whoop in delight, while studying it curiously, as if it was some kind of strange mascot. We watched the creature as he got up on his feet and attempted pressing his foot on the ground. When he stood up, he was about 3 foot tall. He was so incredibly cute. The creature looked at us with wide brown happy eyes, and just glided away. My mother and I both realised we'd seen a young Bigfoot, but it would seem the mother was nowhere in sight. One day the sheriff in our small town got an anonymous phone call from someone using a voice changer, telling him that a deceased body could actually be found in the wooded area that was frequented by the locals, and that the perpetrator of the grisly crime was a very large Sasquatch or a bear. The caller claimed he could not be sure, but whatever it was, it had indeed attacked and killed the deceased man. Surprise, surprise, the dead body found in those woods was of Ralph Mead, and the coroner's report found that he had been hit hard across the head with a violent brute force. The death was ruled as accidental, possibly a bear attack. I was not so sure, of course, whether the rulings were in fact accurate. I knew of a man called Neville who had great reason to want Rolf dead, and I was almost certain he was behind the death. But I perceived his life had already been destroyed and ruined by losing his toddler, so I chose to keep my lips sealed. There was no point in opening old wounds. It would seem that someone may just have been pinning an unexplained mysterious death on Bigfoot, and it probably isn't a first either. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, growing up in a small American town was certainly my idea of perfect, unadulterated bliss, for I didn't have much knowledge about life in the bustling North American cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Boston. It all seemed a world away from the peaceful, carefree, tranquil life that I was so well acquainted with. Of course, the cities still held their sparkling allure, for being the central hub of fashion, culture, food and art. My mother always believed that kids in the cities grew up way too fast and seemingly bypassed their childhoods, whilst my father believed that every kid needed sunshine, fresh air and plenty of opportunities to play. I grew up with 4 siblings, all girls except my brother Walter, who was a year older than I was, and 3 sisters between the ages of 1 and 3 that were still waddling around in their nappies and were significantly younger than we were. Invariably this meant Walter and I became very close, so close in fact that many people thought we were non-identical twins. I loved the fact that Walter never looked on my limitations as a girl, but always encouraged me to do the things that required getting your hands dirty. So maybe under his influences I became somewhat of a tomboy. Our rural neighbourhood was a very close-knit community, and everybody in town knew each other and were on friendly terms. One day something extraordinary happened that most certainly commanded my attention and captivated the scrutiny of the local community. It was one thing to be a fleeting visitor here, just passing through like a migratory bird on a wing, but it was quite another thing altogether, audaciously to move to our neck of the woods, when you had no connection to the place at all, no relatives, no friends, and certainly no employment. That was enough to set the tongues wagging in our local watering hole, where the townsfolk gathered together for karaoke, quizzes, darts, chess, or most often just an indulgent tipple or a well-deserved pint of beer, and of course some local gossip that always went with the territory. The attention grabber in our small town was the addition of a rather mysterious man. He was our new next-door neighbour, a man in his early 30s called Eric Bloomberg, who had moved into the detached wooden home next door to us that had previously belonged to the late Dorothy Penwright, who had passed away the previous summer at the grand old age of 92. I remember the first time I saw the debonair, rather dapper-looking Eric Bloomberg, who was food shopping at the grocery store. It was all I could do not to gawk at the tall, dark, illustrious-looking stranger, for he was, indeed, a fish out of water. Eric was attired in a flashy white Panama hat, white cotton shirt with a very smart silk cravat that swathed his open neckline, a superbly fitted upscale blue jacket with golden buttons, a pair of very smartly creased elegant white pants, complemented by a zooty pair of pointed crocodile shoes. He would have looked trendy walking down the streets of Beacon Hill in Boston, Seacliff in San Francisco, or NoHo or Tribeca in New York. But here he looked so out of place, as if he didn't belong, as people where I live are happy to sport casual denim jeans, sneakers and plaid shirts, and no one ever stands on ceremony, except on special occasions, of course, when the locals go all out to dress to the nines. My mother had surreptitiously pointed Eric out to me in the store and whispered to me excitedly, "That's our new neighbour," she said. "Isn't he handsome? I think he looks like a movie star. But what's he doing buying property in our small town? Goodness only knows. That's what I'm itching to find out. The poor, poor man. He really does look like a square peg in a round hole, don't you think? I should really invite him over to dinner, just to make him feel a little welcome. It must be exceedingly awkward moving to our small town and not knowing a solitary soul." My mother had impetuously manoeuvred her trolley in a cack-handed, rather reckless modus operandi, performing an incautious U-turn that looked suspiciously deliberate as far as I was concerned, and it made a beeline directly towards Eric's legs, finally hitting him with a violent thud. At that inopportune time, Eric had been examining the different choices of blue cheeses on offer, when suddenly a trolley had collided into him, nearly throwing him off balance. Eric had looked up in bewilderment from the cheeses that he'd been inspecting, first at my mother and then at me, his blue eyes growing as wide as saucers. I couldn't help discerning that he looked slightly unhinged for a moment, but he managed to hold it together by keeping a straight, composed face. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry," my mother apologised profusely, pulling the trolley backwards away from the man's legs. These things have a mind of their own, don't they? I never seem to get the hang of it." The man smiled warmly at my mother. "Tell me about it," he said, rolling his eyes backwards, as if commiserating with her. "These trolleys are never built to last, are they? I don't understand why. It really wouldn't kill them to put better wheels on these things, to make it easier for all the customers to manoeuvre." "Are you all right?" my mother asked, with a note of concern in her voice. "I mean, I didn't hurt you bumping into you like that, did I?" "No, of course not," laughed the man. "Yes, you did startle me a little. But no, you certainly didn't hurt me at all." "I'm so relieved to hear that. Oh, I really am. I hope you don't mind my being awfully rude and very impertinent, but I can see you're new in town. You don't by any chance happen to be Eric Bloomberg, do you?" she asked, already knowing the answer to the question very well, and professing ignorance. "I am he," said the man, looking rather bewildered. "The very man, as it happens. It would seem that word of my presence in this small town has certainly travelled around fast. I suppose I shouldn't be very surprised." "Well, fancy bumping into you like this," my mother laughed. "You've made quite an impression in our town, I might add, among all the locals. But then it would be difficult to escape their attention, looking as stylishly turned out as you obviously do. Who would have thought it in a month of Sundays that I would bump into you like this, in a grocery store of all places? Well, I'm Eloise Cordell, your next-door neighbour as it happens, and it is such a pleasure to meet you in these very unlikely circumstances." "Likewise. On the contrary," said Eric, "the pleasure is all mine. I'm assuming from what you're saying, yours must be the pretty yellow house with the grey roof and white windows, am I right?" he asked, raising a quizzical brow. "I think you've got some little kids there, have you not? Toddlers, I think. I've heard them playing in your yard. Sweet little things they are." "That's right," said my mother. "Our house is indeed the yellow one. And yes, I am guilty of having 3 rambunctious toddlers, I'm afraid. I hope they aren't too noisy. Yours is the lovely white house with the terracotta roof, am I right?" "The very same," chuckled the man. "Lovely house indeed, but it certainly requires a great deal of upgrading. Still, a little hard work never hurt a man, and I'll probably enjoy the challenge." "Well, I'm sure the place does need an upgrade, and of course some simple repairs, but still it's as pretty as a picture. It really rather reminds me of a doll's house. It's so perfectly aligned and symmetrical. And that backyard of yours is something else. The old lady who used to live there was an esteemed gardener, which is why the yard is so arresting. When she was alive, she annoyingly won all those gardening competitions. I almost hated her for it. No one ever got a look in, as you can imagine." "Well, that would explain a lot," said Eric. "It's a very mature, established garden, and quite delightful." He turned his attention to me suddenly. "Who, may I ask, is this lovely young lady with you? I assume she's your daughter. Am I right?" "That's right. This is my oldest daughter, Giselle," said my mother. "I've got 2 older children, Giselle and a boy from my first marriage, but their current father, that is their stepfather, is really like a real dad to them, and all they've ever really known." "I'm very pleased to meet you, Giselle. I can see that you've inherited your mother's fair countenance and fine features." At that my mother flushed with embarrassment. "You're quite the charmer, Mr. Bloomberg." "Call me Eric," he said. "I don't like formalities. I'm as laid back as you can get, even if I don't look like I am." "You wouldn't by any chance consider coming over to dinner tonight, Eric?" my mother asked gushingly. "It would be so lovely to welcome you to our neighbourhood and to get to know you a little better. Around here folks are very friendly, and we always make an effort to know all our neighbours. We borrow each other's sugar when we run out and stop for a chat over the yard fence, or drop in for a cup of coffee. You know, that sort of thing. It's very informal around here." Well, I wouldn't say no to your kind offer, said the man. Would 7 o'clock suit you nicely, or is that too late? Perfect, said my mother. I'll see you then. Did you hear that? Said my mother excitedly. We're having our very well turned out next door neighbour coming to dinner tonight. And with that she immodestly upgraded the shopping list, which involved a trip to the butcher's to buy the biggest cut of beef she could find for the pot roast she intended to serve. And so it was at 7 o'clock that evening, after the toddlers had been bathed, fed and tucked away in bed, we were pretty much ready for our new guest. I'd been helping my mother prepare dinner all afternoon by peeling potatoes and slicing vegetables. In a strange way, we almost felt like we were entertaining royalty or some kind of celebrity guest, and I don't mind admitting that my heart was fluttering excitedly and my knees were growing soft and squishy like sponges. It wasn't every day that we invited anyone over formally for dinner, most especially someone with such sartorial elegance. I can't believe you got to meet our neighbour in town, said my brother, whistling, and that he actually agreed to come over to dinner tonight. He's the talk of the town. People everywhere are scratching their heads, pondering as to who he actually is, and why on earth he moved out here. He looks the type that belongs on a yacht, cruising the Mediterranean, or skiing in Aspen. But he's not cut out for a town like ours. We're humble, simple folk around here, and he's way too posh and pretentious for the likes of us. He may be posh, I reflected, but he's a genuinely nice person, and he's not at all puffed up or conceited. On the contrary, he's very down to earth, actually. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised when you meet him, I spontaneously said, rushing to Eric's defence. He must have made quite an impression on me, I thought privately. So he's not stuffy and pompous, then? Absolutely not, I insisted. Finally there was a knock at our front door, and I could hear my father unlock the latch, ushering in our guest. I discerned the low tone of men's voices laughing in the entrance hall, and then my father invited our new guest into the living room, pouring him out a generous glass of gin and tonic. "Where you from?" asked my father cordially. He had not failed to notice the smart camel-coloured pants, cream shirt and formal tweed jacket that Eric was wearing, and it did make him feel rather self-conscious about how sloppy and unkept he looked by contrast. Perhaps he should have put on a decent long-sleeved shirt, he thought to himself. "I'm from a neighbourhood in Lower Manhattan called Tribeca, where I have my own apartment. It's very local and convenient, close to the centre of everything. A pleasant place to live. And very upmarket and ostentatious, if I may say so," said my father. "So you're clearly a man of means," he chuckled. "We don't get too many of those around here, with of course the exception of some of the farmers, who aren't too short of a bob or two. Well, I'm not a self-made millionaire, if that's what you actually think. I was very fortunate to have a wealthy grandfather who gave me huge advantages and privileges in my life. I most certainly idolised him. He was a remarkable character, with a huge sense of humour. He paid all my school fees, and ensured I acquired a first-class education, and for that I am exceedingly grateful. But as a result of my associates and connections, I have mixed with some less than agreeable circles, among the rather soulless socialites, whose only interest in life is keeping up with the Joneses, which is so meaningless and futile to me, something which I quite frankly can never get my head around. For some of those people, no matter how rich they become, it's never ever enough. It's awfully sad, really." "Well, you know the saying, you can't be too rich or too thin," said my father, rubbing his chin reflectively. "But yes, I agree with you. Some of the wealthy in our society falsely believe the more you have, the happier you'll be, when that is definitely not the truth at all. I find some of the smallest things in my life make me the happiest, like the sounds of my children laughing, and watching the little kids open their stockings at Christmas. Those are the kind of things that bring me joy. Let's not kid. Money can most certainly buy you privilege and opportunity, but happiness, no, most certainly not. But your clothes are exceedingly formal for our rather small town. You make me feel decidedly underdressed. Most people around here are just happy to wear jeans." "Oh, don't listen to my husband go on and on talking his nonsense," said my mother. "You look magnificent in your stylish clothes, Eric, and don't let anybody else tell you otherwise. It might do us good to smarten up our act a little bit, and to be a little bit more conscientious about what we actually wear." "I agree," I piped. "I think you look very nice, Eric, very distinguished." Before long we had escorted Eric to our lavishly appointed vintage red and gold dining room, with its luxury paintings hanging pride of place on the sheer walls, along with a stylish oak wooden dresser and a grandiose long side table set out with steaming dishes ready for dinner. The dining room table had been luxuriously swathed in a crisp starched white linen tablecloth, with some of my mother's ornate elaborate silver candelabras on display, with dozens of candle holders filled with golden candles that had been set alight. The flames flickered and danced festively on their wickers in the dim light of the dining room, casting pretty ethereal luminescent shadows on the silver bowl filled with mixed roses, enveloping the whole room in a mysterious, warm but welcoming golden haze. The table had been set with my mother's finest silver cutlery, crystal glasses, and her best china plates that were rimmed in a very deluxe, rather plush gold leaf. My mother began to generously dish out the beef pot roast, along with all the roasted vegetables, cheesy cornbread, gravy, and so many other delicious items, to our hungry guest. Even if I say so myself, my mother was a fabulous cook. "Oh, my word," said Eric. "This smells remarkably good. Very yummy. It would seem I'm going to eat like a king tonight." "Oh, thank you, Eric," said my mother, flushing happily. "I hope you don't mind me asking you a direct question, Eric," she said, looking ever so slightly awkward. "I just wonder why someone like you, from an exclusive, opulent area in New York, would move to our small town. I mean, there's nothing exclusive about our part of the world. We're very ordinary folk around here, and our way of life might seem quite bland for someone like you, who I dare say is more au fait with the bright lights of the big city." "And is it what you really think, Eloise, that your small town is bland compared to New York? Don't sell yourself short. This town of yours is quite magnificent, so quaint and charming, and the people incredibly friendly. Then there's the spectacular, resplendent scenery. Just look around you. Mother Nature around here has certainly bestowed this part of the world in a rich, lavish splendour. Look at the countryside, the pretty meadows, the rugged mountains, the silvery lakes, the exquisite forests. I think you'll find the folk around here are the richest people of all." "I never thought about it like that," said my mother, staring at Eric with large, wondrous brown eyes. "Now I come to think about it, but you're absolutely right. But I'm still dying to know why you chose this town to buy property, as there's so many other beguiling towns here in North America, so why would this one captivate your attention so much?" "You really want to know why I came here, Eloise," he said. "Right, I'll tell you." Eric retrieved a smart leather wallet from the back pocket of the caramel-coloured trousers he was wearing. He began fiddling with his fingers in one of the slitted pockets behind a long, neat row of prestigious-looking credit cards. Finally, he extracted an old piece of worn-down paper. My first thought was that this was a treasure map, indicating the secret location of hundreds of gold nuggets, or a wooden chest of buried treasure, where that could be located. Maybe it had been buried here after the gold rush, and Eric had uncovered a secret map. Wow, I thought, that would be so thrilling, my heart fluttering at this compelling, electrifying idea that certainly served to titillate my imagination. I watched him intently, hardly daring to breathe, as all my focus was on that paper. Slowly Eric unfolded the paper, then I detected a small measure of reluctance on his part, almost as if he was somewhat hesitant in revealing its contents to us. Finally, in a moment of bold tenacity, he passed it around the table. My mother quickly snatched the paper from his hands, with the enthusiasm of a brazen seagull snatching a sandwich from a fisherman's hand. She studied it for a second. I noticed her forehead broke out in long vertical furrows, which suggested the paper left her with more questions than answers. She glanced at Eric. Finally, shrugging her shoulders, she handed it to my father, who passed it then to my brother. I grabbed the paper eagerly when my brother finally passed it over to me. I was rather stunned to see that it was an unusual picture that had been drawn in crayon. But what was it? It appeared to be a picture of a large creature with a pyramid-shaped head and a human-like face, covered in long, flowing, reddish-brown hair. But what was it? "What is this?" I asked Eric. "The correct name is Sasquatch," said Eric. "It's often also described as a wild man of the forest. You can see by the head shape that it's rather ape-like, along with the overlong arms. But other than that, I'd say it's remarkably human." "You mean you moved to this town to look for this strange creature?" I asked, looking perturbed. "I haven't seen anything like that around here." "Have you, Dad?" I asked, looking at him directly. "My father's always out in the woods hunting and fishing. If anyone would have seen a creature like this, it would have to be him." "Well, I haven't seen that," said my father. "Nothing like that before. But I have heard of the wild man. But in truth around here I've not seen anything like that. Not to say that they don't exist, of course." Eric smiled at us encouragingly. "You would be unlikely to see a Sasquatch," he told us confidently. "You could be out there in those woods hunting your entire life and never have an encounter. They might see you, but it's very unlikely that you would see them. They're naturally elusive and reticent by nature, but I gather that they are living in the forests of North America. It was close to your town where my grandfather spotted a Sasquatch. That's the real reason why I'm here. I'm hoping to see one for myself. My grandfather recently died of lung cancer. I asked him if he had any regrets at all. He told me he did have one regret, and that was when he gave me this little picture, which he'd drawn from memory. He told me he wished he'd returned to your small town and looked for a Sasquatch again. So I told him I would do it for him." "What if you don't find it?" I asked. "If at first you don't succeed, try, and try again," said Eric. "I'll keep looking for that creature as long as it takes. I'll be happy for just one little sighting. I won't only be doing it for my grandfather, but for myself as well. And I'm not going to pretend that I'm not deeply curious." "You mean your grandfather saw this Sasquatch creature in and around our town?" I asked Eric, looking astonished. "Are you being serious?" Eric nodded. "I was very close to my grandfather. Such a mellow, very serene person. Loved and adored everything to do with the natural world. One of his favourite pastimes was fishing. It was meditational for him. He would go with his best friend Granger on all these fishing holidays, regularly visiting all kinds of marvellous places around North America. They had a wonderful time together. They would literally bring out the blindfold and take it in turns to touch the map of North America in a fortuitous way. Then they would go and stay in that exact part of America. It was a kind of game to them. They believed if they didn't play that game, they would have missed out on travelling to prodigious, dreamy and inspirational places that they'd never ever heard of before. They stayed in unusual towns and in all types of wilderness areas, and they came back from all their intrepid, audacious adventures with the most extraordinary stories to tell about all the places they'd visited and the amazing people they met. I think the thing that boggled my grandfather the most was the sheer size of America. He kept saying that the average American had no comprehension whatsoever of how large our country really is, which is why your grandfather and his friend Granger ended up visiting our part of the world, I assume," said my brother, at the random touch of a map. "That's exactly what happened," said Eric. "My father visited this town in 1973 with his best friend and fishing buddy. It was allegedly my grandfather's finger that landed on this part of the world." "And it was around here that your grandfather claims to have seen that Sasquatch creature?" I asked again. "But how did it happen?" "It's quite a story, really," said Eric. "In those days, this town of yours was much smaller than it is today. But my grandfather said that he was just so enamoured by your pretty town. Furthermore, the locals in the town welcomed them with open arms, and one of the farmers, who was also a keen fisherman, suggested they all go fishing together at the local lake, and they agreed to the sensational idea. I gather the farmer's wife was quite a fabulous cook and laid out a sumptuous picnic basket for the three of them to enjoy. My grandfather told me it was an exquisite spring morning, and the first blush of the aurora enveloped the valley in a warm refulgence. He said that all three of them were enthused and exhilarated about going fishing that day. They arrived at the lake, and he had never seen anything more spectacular in his entire life. He said it was the way that the first light of the day caused the silvery lake to just shimmer and scintillate in the morning sun like a glittering mirror, and the lakefront trees of the wood grove that surrounded it at every single angle were reflected in that water. Before long they found a small sandy beach on one side of the lake, and that was where they set up their camping chairs and their fishing gear, and they cast out their rods. It was still very early in the morning. The far side of the lake was surrounded by very attractive sculptural rocky outcrops. At one point, with a beer in his hands, my grandfather decided to climb some of those rocky outcrops. The other two men who were fishing looked up to see my grandfather putting a finger on his lips, indicating for them to be silent and to follow him, remaining very quiet. They could see he had something he wanted to show them, and so they very surreptitiously trailed after him. None of the men could believe what they were discerning. My grandfather said they saw two little creatures, possibly about 3 foot tall, sitting on their haunches and focusing intently on a pile of stones, piling one on top of the other, with the flattest and largest at the bottom and the smallest and thinnest at the top, like a very tall tower. It was rather like watching two kids playing with Lego blocks. The little younglings appeared very intelligent and very caught up in what they were doing. The towers they were making were about 1 foot tall, and they focused on getting the balance absolutely right so that the tower did not collapse. Their nimbleness was very impressive for one so young. Of course, my grandfather didn't know what he was discerning, but he certainly knew that these things were not bears. He said they looked like humans with pyramid-shaped faces, very overlong arms covered in long, flowing brown-red hair that appeared more scant under the arm area. My grandfather suddenly grew very alarmed because he sensed that something wasn't right. Something was watching them. It sent chills running down his spine and caused his hair to stand on end. It occurred to him that they might all be in very grave danger, especially if an angry protective mother was loitering around. And the thought gave him a measure of angst that he could not describe. He began pondering over this thought, and then a flood of stones began being hurled at all three men in an avalanche of rocks. Then they heard the most terrifying growl. My grandfather believed it was more irksome and more threatening than the roar of a lion. That was when he saw her. My grandfather said nothing on this earth could prepare him for what they were seeing. It was a creature that towered at 8 foot tall, was stockily built with very large muscular thighs, and a large pair of buttocks, a barrelled chest, and a very low-slung drooping pair of breasts, with a pyramid-shaped head and overlong arms. It seemed that the face appeared very human, but those deep-set, troubled eyes looked inflamed with indignation. It began to scream ballistically at them, proceeding to pursue them while continually throwing stones in their direction, missing them by mere inches. It was clear she wanted them gone, as far away from her younglings as possible, and was exceedingly protective of her progeny. My grandfather said on reflection she had probably meant them no harm, because if she had, she could have done them in a heartbeat, without any trouble whatsoever. My grandfather said all three of them were completely out of breath when they finally reached the rover, and in a state of total and utter shock. They were shaking, and his heart was thundering so hard in his ears that he could feel every single vibration. Worse still, he broke out into a cold sweat, and when he dived into the driving seat of the car, his hands were so slippery they were sliding precariously all over that wheel. That's what fear can do to you. My grandfather could see the creature racing after their car, waving her hands indignantly after them, screaming at them as they drove away. The farmer was literally weeping in terror, while his best friend sat in the back of the car, as white as a sheet, the colour drained from his face, and all he could say the whole time was, "Did you see that? Did you see that? Did you see that?" My father drove straight to the local watering hole, but all three men sat in the back of that Rover for a good hour before they finally managed to get out of the car. And then they succeeded in drinking all afternoon and got seriously bladdered, which was unusual behaviour for all three men. Unbeknown to the farmer, his wife had returned to the lake to pick up the picnic basket, and it would seem she wasn't harassed by the mysterious creature. It had long gone, but all the food had appeared to be taken as well, and in place in the basket were a few river rocks. I gather she knew something was wrong instinctively when she discovered that the fishing tackle that they had been using had not been touched, and there was no sign of the men. She called the sheriff and was furious to discover that her husband was completely sloshed at the local watering hole. She screamed blue murder at my grandfather and his friend, of course, telling them to get the hell out of town and to come nowhere near her husband again, because they were an appalling influence on him, and he had barely touched a drop in years. "So did your grandfather leave town?" I asked. Eric nodded. "Why did your father want to see the Sasquatch again?" I said. "I mean, he was so scared out of his skull. Why would he want to go through that again?" "He told me he believed the Sasquatch they encountered was a protective mother, but not naturally aggressive by nature. By that time he'd done some research on the matter and developed an insatiable curiosity and fascination for the creature, and wanted to find more answers, and another encounter was very, very desirable to him, under more favourable circumstances, that is." In the years and months that followed, Eric remained living in our small town, and married a lovely local girl, and became one of the most loved locals in our community. One thing that never ever changed, and that was Eric's pronounced sense of style. He never resorted to wearing jeans. He always dressed in the most swanky ensemble, whether rain or sun, and so he soon earned the acclaim of the town eccentric. All these years later, he is still hoping for a random sighting of the creature known as Bigfoot, but to date, one has never yet crossed his path. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, most young girls dream of the day when they walk down the aisle, in the more modern contemporary equivalent of an exquisite Cinderella-style wedding gown, to marry the man of their dreams, whom has captured and won over their hearts. Their whimsical imaginations dance with the sparkling, glittering images of the quintessential perfect day, where nothing ever goes awry or amiss, and everything just flows so seamlessly, without a single hiccup, and following that flawless, consummate sequence of events, a life filled with so many happily ever afters. You never imagined for a single moment that the very best day of your life could turn out to be your worst day ever, a day so hideously dreadful and so deplorable that even remembering it hurts badly. It leaves behind a nagging dull ache in your heart, a bitter taste in your mouth, scratchy and dry, a desperate longing for hopes that were lost, like a ship wrecked out at sea, thrown violently against the rock so treacherously that it is beyond salvaging, or even beginning to save, as the damage is irredeemable. That was me once upon a time, about 12 long years ago to be precise. I was blindly oblivious, a dewy-eyed bride that naively, gullibly believed that nothing could ever go awry or amiss on her special day. How could I be so ignorant, so guileless and impressionable? Everything had been planned to perfection, which included all the last-minute details of the wedding, from the 3-tiered wedding cake in 3 different flavours, namely carrot, red velvet, and lemon with poppy seeds, to the bridesmaids' dresses, along with the opulent Italianesque wedding venue in Washington State, surrounded by acres of verdant green turf, exquisite rose gardens, and large clusters of Douglas firs and spruce trees. I had been fleeceably swept off my feet by my worldly husband Ricardo Hernados, and after a year of dating, he'd finally popped the question to me. I hadn't hesitated, not even for a brief second, for from the moment we met, my heart had literally done a double flip. Ricardo was everything that I could have ever wanted in a husband: kind, thoughtful, charming, and funny. It didn't hurt either that he was tall, dark, handsome, and very easy on the eyes. I had fallen for him very hard, and I was in no doubt that this was the man for me, the person that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with through sickness and health. I still remember the way my sister Amelia had reacted the very first time she met him. I vividly recall her saying to me, "Sis, this one's a keeper, and he's so hot," which of course is an added bonus. Even my parents had been warmed by the beguiling charm and allure of my fiancé, and my pernickety, pedantic mother pretty much fancied marrying him herself, and said as much, in a jovial, fun-loving way, which certainly meant Ricardo met her seal of approval, and my mother wasn't easy to please at the best of times. I glanced at my reflection in the mirror, and admired the curvaceous contours of my long flowing wedding dress at every single angle. It was such a magnificent sheer satin fabric that sparkled with glittery diamonds on its bodice. I gasped in wondrous awe at my magnificent reflection, barely even recognizing the beautiful girl staring back at me in the long mirror. Was that really me, I wondered in awe? I really did look incredible, I thought, even if I said so myself. My curtain of long, dark, straight hair had been curled and lifted upwards, accentuating my high cheekbones on my heart-shaped face, whilst the spiring ringlets of hair had been expertly clasped together by a comb of creamy pearls. My makeup had been done with the subtle expertise of a professional artist, accentuating my very best features. I took in a deep breath. My heart began pounding like a bass drum. It wouldn't be long now before I would finally become Mrs. Hernados, I thought excitedly. I began to quiver nervously, shaking like a jelly, my knees feeling as soft as marshmallows, while the nervous tension pulsated through my body like electric charges. I glanced down from the arched window of my bedroom suite at the venue. There was a sea of cars filling the driveway steadily. I could see my eager guests, clad in their finest clothes, along with their fancy eclectic hats, hastily making a beeline towards the wedding chapel, their legs almost running across the green turf, in their earnest impatience to find a very good seat. It wouldn't be long now, I thought, drawing in a deep, long breath. My father should be here in any second to collect me and guide me down the aisle. My bridesmaids would be waiting for me at the entrance of the chapel. I could hardly wait, but my fingers had become hot and clammy as I thought about all the eyes on me as I walked down the long resplendent red carpet. I was not inclined to enjoy being the centre of attention, even if it was only for a day. But regardless, I was determined to enjoy every minute of it. I could hear a little knock on the door of my bedroom suite, and I glanced at the clock. Surely that wasn't my father already, I sighed. He was way too early, I thought. But never mind, he might be able to calm down my rising level of angst. "Come in, Dad," I said. I was expecting to see my father, but imagine my surprise to see my younger sister Amelia standing there in her emerald green bridesmaid dress. She looked stunning, I thought, but the large upturned skull on her face most certainly robbed her of any attractiveness. She looked decidedly pugnacious and confrontational, like someone who had a bone of contention to pick with me. And on my wedding day of all things, I thought, couldn't it wait? Why was she so hell-bent on dampening and ruining the very best day of my life? If the shoe was on the other foot, I would most certainly not upset her on her wedding day, no matter what. "What's wrong?" I said, seeing my sister's frosty face go ashen white. "Are you all right, Amelia? You look like you're going to faint. Has something happened?" Alarm bells began pulsating through my body like electric shocks. I began to wonder if someone had been involved in a tragic car accident. My sister's brown eyes looked piercingly glacial, as she stared at me without a glint of kindness or compassion. Her nostrils flared, and the muscles around her jaw tightened significantly. I had never seen her look so frigidly cold and mean like this before, rather reminding me of a crotchety, bad-tempered fishwife from the Pike Place Fish Market in Washington State, the kind of woman who spends her entire life bickering, nagging, and shouting. "Come with me now," she said, virtually pushing me out of the bedroom. "You need to see Ricardo, right now." Her tone was sharp, hostile, and unnerving. I felt exactly like a naughty schoolgirl being marched off to the headmistress's office to receive a stern punishment. "Don't be silly," I protested. "What you're doing, Amelia? Don't you know it's bad luck to see him before the wedding, in my brand new dress?" My sister failed to listen, but with one hand she roughly pushed me towards Ricardo's bedroom, knocking on the door. "Who's there?" said Ricardo, opening the door, whilst busying his fingers by fastening a velvet green bow tie around his neckline of a very elegant dress shirt. He looked really stunning. My sister pushed the door back violently, and with one hand virtually pushed me into the room, while my stiletto heels nearly caused me to lose my balance, as I went gliding backwards, almost tripping up on myself, but luckily Ricardo stopped my fall in an instant, and I managed to steady myself on my legs. "What you doing here?" said Ricardo. "It's bad luck for me to see you in your wedding dress." My sister glared at Ricardo with inflamed eyes that reminded me of a wild cat. "Tell her," she screamed at Ricardo, "or shall I? Shall I tell her, or are you going to?" "Tell me what?" I asked, my eyes darting from Ricardo to my sister, back to Ricardo again. "Well, are you going to tell her?" "We've been having an affair," said my sister. "Ricardo loves me. He doesn't love you at all. I'm sorry, but you need to know the truth before it's too late. You don't want to marry a man who's in love with someone else, do you? I couldn't do that to you, sis. That would be grossly unfair." "Shut up, Amelia. That's not true," said Ricardo, looking at me earnestly. "We did have a fling. I'll admit to that. But it meant nothing. Absolutely nothing. Your sister, she's the one that seduced me. But I don't love her. I could never love her. I only love you, Evangeline. I've eyes only for you. It's you I want, not her." For a moment I stood there, like an ice statue, hardly daring to believe the words that I'd just heard. They plunged into my heart like sharp blades, stabbing me over and over again with a tortuous, unforgiving pain. How could two people that I loved better than life itself betray me in this atrociously despicable, heartless way? "It's not true," I trembled. "It can't be." The tears now flooding down my cheeks like heavy raindrops. My whole body became numb with the shock, as if every feeling of mine was momentarily paralysed, as the gravity of what I'd heard was too momentous and heavy to take on board. It was like being hit by a sudden volcano, and the molten lava trickling down the mountain, stinging your soul, burning you from the inside out, until there is nothing left of you but smouldering ash. "I don't understand," I blurted out. Why would you do this to me?" "I'm sorry, sis," said Amelia heartlessly. "But whether Ricardo admits it or not, we're both in love. And this should be my wedding day, not yours," she snapped. "Shut up, Amelia. You're just seething with jealousy because I don't want you. I never have, and I never ever will. You aren't a patch on your sister here," he said, looking at me devotedly and reaching for my hand. "It's you I love, Evangeline, and that's a promise. We were meant to be together forever," he said, kissing my hand. "You're beautiful. You're kind and loving. Everything that your sister is not. This is why I love you so much." I snapped my hand away, glaring at both my sister and then at Ricardo. "You both disgust me," I cried in horror. How could you even do this to me?" And at that, I bolted towards my bedroom suite, hurriedly grabbing my handbag and car keys and hurtling down the sweeping staircase, through the lobby, across the luxuriant turf, past the rose gardens, and finally towards the gravel parking lot, fringed by large oak trees. I made a hasty dash towards my car. I was getting the hell out of here. I had no intention of getting humiliated. I flung open the car door and dived onto my seat, shaking violently like a jelly. I placed on my safety belt and glanced up to see my sister smiling, a mean, vindictive, nasty, almost triumphant smile. She was enjoying every minute of this, I thought, whilst Ricardo was waving me down frantically, shouting, "Stop! Stop, Evangeline! Can we not talk about this? This is our wedding day, for goodness sake! You can't throw us away! Not like this!" I didn't care. I didn't care at all. In that instant, my world had been turned upside down. Everything had changed. Nothing would ever be the same again. I found myself zooming out of that venue, passing some surprised wedding guests who were probably wondering why the bride had now become a runaway and was abandoning her own wedding. I drove down some of those blissfully beautiful backcountry roads, lined with tall, statuesque Douglas firs. My thoughts were a whirling tornado of disbelief and horror, scattered around like the leftover debris after a storm. I was that debris, torn apart, dishevelled, no longer held together in one complete whole. I had lost myself, for the me I had known had been ripped apart, almost as if sharp wedges of shrapnel had sliced through me, shredding me into tiny, tiny smithereens. Could this really be happening to me? It felt too surreal, almost as if this horrible nightmare that I was experiencing was most certainly not real. Why had my sister betrayed me like this, with my own fiancé of all things? How could she do this to me? Didn't families have boundaries? As for Ricardo, how dare he cheat on me so indiscriminately, and with my sister of all people? It didn't get lower, nor did it get more depraved than this. In an instant, all the admiration that I once held for Ricardo withered away like a wild flower wilting on the open prairie, dying after a hot day in the sun, its fleeting beauty permanently expunged from it, as it finally shrank back to become one with the earth again. I knew that my relationship with Ricardo could never ever be fixed again, for the damage was done. It was way too severe to be repaired, for our relationship had breathed its very last, and the heart of who we once were as a couple was now in coronary arrest, beyond being brought back from the brink of death. It had beaten its very last. Tears of regret, disappointment, betrayal, bitterness, and lost dreams and hopes of what we could have been continued to roll down my cheeks, and the watery tsunami clouded my visibility in its hazy blur. I was losing focus on the road, and if I wasn't careful, I could drive into a tree. I knew I needed to calm down, so I drew over to the side of the road that overlooked an embankment, and I just parked for a brief moment and stared out into space. The outside world seemed so normal. The elegant Douglas firs looked like tall, serene giants, and the woodlands seemed so peaceful and tranquil. Yet in my heart, I was the direct antithesis of all of this. I decided I would take a walk in this pretty grove of trees to clear my head of any cobwebs, to calm down myself. Why should I give Ricardo the satisfaction of grieving over our lost relationship, I thought angrily. Why waste my time expending energy on someone not worthy of my affections? I glanced down at my beautiful wedding dress and deliberately ripped the central panel of it, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as I did this. Perhaps it was a symbolic gesture on my part, symbolizing the end of our relationship and a marriage that could never be. I proceeded to walk through the woods, trying to empty my mind of all my thoughts, like a bag of bird seeds that I wanted to eject and expel, hoping that they would eat those seeds, or those thoughts, so to speak, so that all would be forgotten and remembered no more. Was I such an appallingly bad judge of character, I wondered? Had I not seen through Ricardo's fake charm that he piled on so thick when women were around? What an idiot I was, I thought, scolding myself for falling for a man as flaky and unreliable as Ricardo. And as for my sister, look at her. Where on earth were her family morals and ethics? It seemed like she had none at all. Our relationship was left dangling precariously now on tender hooks. Its fate did not look promising. How does one move away from the betrayal of a sister? Surely it drives a lifelong wedge between the two of you. And over a man of all things, who was pathetic and unworthy like Ricardo Hernardo's. Perhaps in the long term she'd done me a favour and showed me what he was rarely made of. It was a little like discovering the diamond ring you wore all your life, that you believed was so precious, was only made of glass and had no value whatsoever. As I walked through the woods, I was struck suddenly by how pretty it all was. I started to gather a whole lot of pine cones in the loose material of my dress that I now had torn off to make a makeshift handbag, and then I sat at the edge of a rocky clearing and began hurling the pine cones as hard as I could at the tree. It felt amazingly good, almost like an emotional release of that pent-up anger that I was feeling. It was almost like a letting go. I continued to hurl pine cones at the tree as hard as I could, pretending that the tree was Ricardo, and that every single cone was now kicking him in the guts so hard that he was crying out in desperate pain. Good, I thought with satisfaction. Good. I hope it really hurts. I hope it bloody hurts, like you've hurt me. Now you see what it feels like. Something or someone began to join in with me in my strange woodland game. Someone else was throwing pine cones at the very same tree I was, but who, I wondered, looking around in surprise. No one was there, but I could hear a strange chattering sound, a sound that I cannot really explain. It sounded a bit like this, and then a large pyramid-shaped head with a deeply tanned human face peered at me from behind a large leafy sapling. At first, this strange anomalous creature appeared somewhat reticent, but I just ignored it and continued to gather my pine cones from the ground, throwing them at the tree again and again, completely lost in my own secret world, and so disconnected to everything that was happening around me. So much so that I almost didn't give the creature a second thought. I think I was otherwise so engaged in my thoughts, locked up in the disturbing emotions that they provoked, intermingled with brief interludes where I couldn't help myself from sobbing. But my strange incongruous behaviour, wrought with sadness and deep despair, had certainly given this creature a bird's-eye view of the turmoil I was experiencing, and I believe it felt my hopelessness, as physically as you and I would feel a wind blowing against our faces. It would seem my emotional turbulence drew this creature out of its hiding place with a confidence, like a rabbit from its burrow. And then this thing, this large thing, drew back the curtain of shrubbery, gliding towards me, stopping only inches away from me, and standing there. It stood there staring at me, like a tall statue in an opulent courtyard of one of those great icons in our history. That was how still the creature was. And then on her haunches she gathered some pine cones, dropping them into my lap, and keeping some all for herself. And we both sat from each other about a foot apart, throwing pine cones at that tree, over and over and over again. She would collect the pine cones that had fallen, dividing them between us, and we would take turns in hitting that tree. Every time I hit the tree, I certainly imagined it was Ricardo, and it was so satisfying. I was beginning to so enjoy the presence of this strange anomalous creature. I know it sounds completely crazy, but I do believe she was comforting me. And I do think she sensed the way I was feeling, and almost identified with it. I glanced at her, and it was like these golden pools of liquid love were softening the jagged edges of my broken heart. Of course I thought to myself, this has to be a Bigfoot, a creature of whom many has dismissed as legend. But here she was, larger than life, in touching distance of me. She towered at about 7.5 foot tall, possessing a small pair of pert breasts. Her body was thick-set and dense, with powerful muscular definition, and strong arm and bicep muscles, and very impressive shoulders. Her body was covered with long flowing hair of a dark auburn colour, while her head was shaped rather like a cone, which folded seamlessly into the shoulders, and I can't be sure whether she had a neck or not, because it wasn't very discernible to me. In my opinion, she looked more human than ape-like, especially in the facial area, which was strikingly human. Of course, those overlong arms that hung beyond the knees were rather primate-like. I noticed the area where the hands touched the knees and the arms that fell to the sides was absent of hair, as well as under the arm area, and on the knee area itself, where I imagine the skin tends to chafe itself like sandpaper. All of a sudden the creature glided away, taking her cover behind a sapling. As she sensed that something was coming, I hadn't heard anything at that stage. Then I heard the heavy footfall of crunching forest debris as they approached, and then I saw the silhouette of a man in a wedding suit. It was Ricardo. Typical, I thought. Why did he have to spoil things? Why did he come after me like this? I didn't want to see him at all. He must have seen my car parked on the side of the road. I didn't want him here. Why doesn't he go away and leave me alone? I want to be alone. "Oh, there you are," said Ricardo, with a concerned expression on his face. "I'm worried about you. The wedding guests are back at the venue, enjoying the delicious buffet. But it's not too late. We can get married in the dining hall. I checked with the priest, and he's more than happy to oblige the request. I told him you'd stormed off in a hissy fit, and we had a pre-wedding tiff, but I was going to sort things out between us. So come on, let's go back and get married, shall we?" "Sort things out," I said. "Are you kidding, Ricardo? There are some things that can never be fixed, and this is one of them. You had an affair with my sister, for crying out loud. In my book, that's a deal breaker. It's over, Ricardo. Do you get it? It's over." Ricardo's voice became enraged. I'd never seen him like this before. "Don't be ridiculous, Evangeline," he piped. "I told you that your sister came on to me. She was the one that instigated the affair. It meant nothing to me. It was only a bit of fun. Now go on, let's go and get married." "What the heck have you done to your dress?" he asked, looking appalled. "It's all torn up." "No," I said. "I'm not going to marry you. You cheated on me. And yes, I deliberately tore the dress up, if you must know." Ricardo began grabbing me and trying to push me through the woods back to his car. "You can marry me like this," he said. "You just snagged your dress on some brambles. That's what we'll say. You're coming back now, Evangeline. We're getting married. Stop being such a big baby." I began to push Ricardo away with my hands. "Leave me alone! Get off me! I don't want to be anywhere near you. I told you, it's over. We're over. Now go away!" I shouted, raising my voice angrily. All of a sudden we could hear a loud warning growl. It sounded like a tiger was in our midst, and for a second Ricardo stopped dead in his tracks and said, "What the hell? I think there's a mountain lion in here. Something is stalking us. It's stalking us. We need to get out of here right now. The animal is dangerous. It could kill us," he said. I could see his eyes were wide with alarm, and he was physically shaking. It was a very discomposing growl. Then there she was, larger than life, my Bigfoot friend, running directly towards Ricardo and chasing after him, screaming at the top of her lungs, and that scream was so chilling it went right through me. Ricardo was so terrified. "Run! Evangeline, run! This thing, it's going to kill us! It's going to kill us!" he screamed. I wasn't afraid, for I knew that this Bigfoot female would never hurt me. But she was chasing off Ricardo, knowing instinctively that he was the cause of my upset. I could hear him screaming in terror, and I'm afraid I felt no pity for him. I wish I did, but I didn't. His car engine started up, and he began driving away at lightning speed. I could hear his thick rubber tires screeching. When the Bigfoot finally returned, she indicated to me through some miming body language that she felt Ricardo was not a good person. I was amazed she picked up on his energy and seen what I'd failed to see myself. I spent another hour playing with the Bigfoot, and this kind creature lifted my spirits immeasurably. When I indicated that I needed to go, she seemed bitterly disappointed and expressed this by rolling her head to the left. She stepped forward, ruffled my hair affectionately, as if she'd known me all my life as a personal, close and very special friend. All of a sudden she noticed my sparkling pearly comb, and so I took it out of my hair and placed it in her hands, giving her a pocket mirror so she could see what it looked like. I remember she looked in the mirror at her hair comb and began to whoop happily in delight, jumping up and down like an excitable kid. I almost forgot how sad I was, because no one has ever been this happy with any gift I've ever given them before. But for this Bigfoot, receiving my hair comb was like winning the lottery for her. She was thrilled. She escorted me back to my car and watched me leave. Looking back, it was like being rescued by an angel on the lowest day of my life, when the gates of hell opened up for me. That happened a long time ago, and I never saw Ricardo again, nor did he resume his relationship with my sister Amelia. It was difficult to forgive my sister for the hurt she'd caused me, and all these years later, although I have forgiven her, our relationship is not close, but I am making every effort to open my heart to her, as living with bitterness in life is no life at all. I never saw the Bigfoot again, but if you see a Bigfoot wearing a pearly comb, it may just be my Bigfoot friend. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the shrill, high-pitched sound of the telephone enveloped the pristine silence with its offensive, intrusive and strident tone. It was annoyingly ringing off the hook, rather like a spoilt, petulant child demanding attention and stamping her obstinate feet in retribution because she wasn't getting any. There were university students lying in crumpled heaps in lumpy sleeping bags scattered liberally across the floor of my sister's apartment, rather like they do in the lobbies of international airports, most especially places like Dubai, where you're almost tripping over sleeping bodies lying everywhere, all waiting for their international flights. It would seem my sister's opulent, rather lavish Seattle apartment had become a sea of bodies that looked almost half dead, all in the throes of recovery from the alcoholic frenzy of the previous night. The blurred, obscure memories of the previous evening were now hazy and fuzzy to me, but I seemed to remember the beginning part of the evening where we'd bopped the night away to 80s disco music. Those fabulous songs were still drumming away in my ears with their rhythmic beat. I seem to remember we'd ordered dozens of pizzas from the local parlour across the road, washed down with copious amounts of alcoholic beverages, and I'd gone too far. My heart sank, and feelings of guilt-ridden shame descended over my consciousness as I visualised my sister's mortified reaction, if she did indeed have a bird's-eye view of the dreadful state her apartment was now in. I can assure you I would be turfed out of my lodgings in a heartbeat if she had seen its current deplorable state, for it looked like a doss-house. My sister was a very particular, punctilious person who kept her apartment in spotless condition and was exceedingly house-proud. Luckily for me, she was out of town for a couple of nights and would be none the wiser. Well, that was if I got my act together. The red wine stains on her cream carpet needed cleaning out, and the pizza boxes that were scattered precariously across the floor, along with the empty beer and wine bottles, needed throwing out at once. Also, the bathroom needed cleaning, because someone had thrown up in there, and the nauseating stench had descended over the bedroom suite, and wasn't pretty at all. The quintessential evidence of our night-long alcoholic binge was clear to see, and needed to be removed without a trace, or there would be hell to pay, and I didn't want to face the wrath of my cantankerous sister. The vociferous phone persisted in its ear-piercing frenzy, and the floor was wiggling with groaning students saying, "Someone, oh someone, please answer that dreadful phone! It's doing my head in!" I remember imagining that the person at the other end of the phone had to be a monster. Who else could they be? I mean, how dare they wake us up at this early hour of the morning, I thought, glancing briefly at my watch. Goodness gracious, it was already 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Where had the time vanished to? Reluctantly, I wiggled out of my sleeping bag, resigned to answering that tiresome phone that had now morphed into a nagging old woman that I seriously wanted to throttle. My head was thundering with a violent headache that pounded on the front side of my head and seemed to travel to the back. and there was no sign of it abating. I was in no doubt I was suffering a serious hangover from overdoing it last night with all my university friends. I was beginning to regret the spur-of-the-moment decision to have this party that had sprung up at the very last minute like a late seasonal flower. It hadn't helped that last night I'd seriously overindulged myself and drunk like a fish. "Hello," I said, lifting up the receiver, resisting the temptation to scream down the phone, "Will you please shut up and leave us all alone?" "Hello," came a woman's syrupy sweet voice. "Can I speak to Fleming, please?" "That's me," I said. "How can I help you?" "Oh, I'm so glad I've caught you," came the woman's voice with an audible relieved sigh. "Oh, I'm so sorry to phone you last minute, especially on a Sunday afternoon like this. It's awfully rude of me, I know, but I'm in a desperate need of help. Something came up at the very last minute. A sister of mine in Boston, well, she's not very well. I need to go and see her. I believe you offer house-sitting services. Word around the grapevine is you're very reliable and trustworthy. Dorothy Pender gave me your number, and she thinks the world of you. Insists that you're very good with animals. So not to beat around the bush, I need you in my employ for a few days. Periwinkle is a very particular animal, so I know that I can feel assured that under your charge she'll be in excellent hands. I would like to book you, please, for a week or so, if that's agreeable with you." "Sorry to hear about your sister," I said. "That's not good news. I hope she gets better soon. I'm quite willing to help you under the circumstances. When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow night, if that's agreeable with you," she said. "Tomorrow night," I thought aghast. That was not much advance warning at all, but still, the money would come in handy, so I would be a fool to refuse this opportunity. As being a student, I wasn't exactly flush with cash. Any opportunity to make a bob or two was not to be sneezed at. "That'll be fine," I said. "What am I house-sitting exactly? A dog or a cat?" I asked. And then adding a little humour to the equation, I added, "I draw the line at babysitting lions and tigers." "Oh, heavens, no, nothing like that," came the woman's voice. "Well, to be fair, she is a feline from the cat family, but she's a domestic cat called Periwinkle. Of course she thinks she's a goddess. She's terribly vain. Now, she is very particular, incredibly fussy, so I have prepared a menu for her, and I would be much obliged if you could follow it exactly, with just a little poaching and steaming and frying here and there. Will that be all right with you? It's very simplistic, really." I raised a quizzical, rather amused brow at the other end of the phone, knowing full well that this was a punctilious cat owner who was possibly more discriminating and particular than the cat itself. "It sounds straightforward enough," I said. I had dealt with her assiduous kind before. "Now, there are a couple of other things I need to tell you about. I have a neighbour living next door who's diabetic. Her name is Alice Harper. I always phone her every day at 5 o'clock to be exact in the afternoon, just to check on her. I worry about her, because she has a mind like a sieve. She's terribly forgetful. I call her to make sure she's taken her meds, because if her blood sugar sinks too low, it can be problematic." "Of course," I said. "No problem at all. I'll phone her at 5 every afternoon. I have a diabetic aunt. I know the score." "Well, that's good to know," she said. "Oh, and by the way, I do have a few houseplants that require watering." "Fine," I said, taking down all her details and replacing the receiver. Tomorrow night, I thought. That didn't bring me much time to get over my hangover and to clean up my sister's place. As it happens, time did go by very speedily. Thankfully, I'd succeeded in cleaning my sister's flat. Before long, I was driving my white 1980s Ford Pinto two-door hatchback towards Elizabeth Churchill's home that was located in a rural neighbourhood in Washington state. In those days, some of the roads were still rather rough and ready and not very well appointed, although many were beginning to be tarmacked. I was to discover that although Elizabeth's neighbourhood was quite well built up, most of the residential properties were heavily fringed by vast areas of forest, wildflower meadows, farmers' fields, rugged outcrops, along with pretty streams. It really was all rather beguiling, and without question breathtakingly beautiful. It was good to get away from Seattle into the fresh, crisp air of the countryside. This house-sitting opportunity could potentially be rather fun, I thought, thankful that I'd brought my hiking boots with me, along with my mountain bicycle and some of the books I needed to study. It most certainly meant that the house-sitting of Periwinkle was going to offer me the opportunity during the day to go on a short hiking stint or a cycling adventure. And why not? I didn't have to hang out at the house all day with a cat that probably was sooner I wasn't there anyway. As I arrived at Elizabeth Churchill's home and parked my car under the carport, I was struck with how enchantingly twee her picturesque cottage appeared to be. If you'd placed it in the heart of the English countryside, it would not have looked out of place. It had that quaint, idiosyncratic old-world charm about it, and oozed tons and tons of character. I'd never stayed in an eccentric, whimsical cottage like this before, and I was intrigued and tantalised by it. It was symmetrical in shape, with a front facade that was built from stone, and the rest of the house was built from whitewashed brick, and there were complementary large sash windows and a perfectly central front door that was painted in a bright daffodil yellow colour, which surprisingly worked. There was a cobbled stone pathway that led to the front door, fringed by large beds filled with colourful blooming roses and hedges of lavender, where butterflies and bees were busying themselves dancing from one bloom to another in their phenomenal act of pollination. I walked up the stone steps and reached under the pot plant holder for the front door keys, where Elizabeth had told me I'd find them. Ah, there they were. Good, I thought happily. They jingled in my hands, and the door creaked as I prized it open. I was surprised to see that inside the cottage was an open modern floor plan, vastly contradicting the outside appearance of the house, which seemed rather incongruous, but still it was very stylishly executed and was cosy and inviting, with contemporary artwork on the walls and exquisite comfortable furnishings. The lower floor just sprawled out into one large seamless open space, with the kitchen and living areas interwoven together so fluidly, along with a delightful wood-burning stove and a very substantial ornate marble fireplace that was positioned pride of place in the centre of the room. On one side was a very well-appointed bookshelf that lined the entire wall, overflowing with stunning books, suggesting that Elizabeth Churchill was a woman devoted to reading. But with a surname like Churchill, that was not surprising to me at all. Sunlight flickered through the open windows, bespeckling the floor in a radiant golden yellow light, and even the reflection of the windows could be seen on the white marbled floors, all covered with exquisite rich Persian rugs in resplendent reds and golds. As I had secretly suspected, Periwinkle was found lying stretched out on one of the sofas that was basked in the warm sunlight, looking like the Queen of Sheba. The window possessed a pretty view over the emerald turf, along with the brightly coloured beds of roses bursting with vibrant reds, pinks and yellow blooms. I began running my fingers softly through her luxuriant silky coat of long white hair. She looked up at me from a sleeping position, very suspiciously. Then she closed her eyes slowly and began to purr, as she enjoyed my skillful massage. It was so good sitting in the sun after the long drawn-out winter we'd recently experienced. I decided to join Periwinkle on the couch, and I grabbed one of Elizabeth's books titled The Murder of Cherry Page, and became so embroiled in the book, written by an unknown author. It was so good, I couldn't put it down. Periwinkle had surreptitiously wormed her way onto my lap, and the two of us became like lizards, wallowing in the sunshine all day. At this rate, I wouldn't get any hiking done, let alone any of my students' studies, but I had to find out who had murdered Cherry. Finally, I raised myself out of the couch, as now the room had become significantly cooler, and the sun had all but faded away. I ambled over to the kitchen with Periwinkle trotting close behind me, for she rightly assumed that I was attending to her dietary needs, and seemed to think her supervision was well in order, as she watched my every move, waiting for her dinner to be served. I was beginning to feel like the cat's butler, and discerned that a bow might be in order as I waited on this elegant queen. I pulled out a plate from the refrigerator covered in plastic with a sign on it reading "Periwinkle's dinner tonight," along with strict instructions on how the salmon should be poached. Periwinkle watched me attentively as I poached her fish, and once I had cooked it and served it to her, she meowed and then began to eat it hungrily, despite the fact that it was piping hot. She seemed to like it that way. After her meal was served, she began to clean herself with her paws, and then returned to the couch to continue her sleeping. No wonder they say it's a cat's life. I knew I should be studying, but after my dinner, feeling satisfied and content, I also returned to the settee with Periwinkle once again, taking pride of place on my lap. I reasoned with myself that reading the book tonight would be absolutely fine, just for tonight, I told myself, and then tomorrow I would return back to my student studies. I realised with horror that I was beginning to sound exactly like my mother, who always decided that she would eat the chocolate cake just today, and tomorrow the diet would begin, but invariably tomorrow never ever came. Darkness descended over the entire front yard, and a half-moon broke out over the horizon, along with a pretty scattering of silvery stars. My eyes suddenly shut, closing like blinds on a window, and then my head drooped to one side, and my body finally tilted over, and I began to fall into a deep sleep. All of a sudden I was awoken to a heavy crashing sound as a rock was flung through the window, landing on the couch only yards away from me, and the cat just jumped up with a start, bolting from the settee, her tail puffed up to double the size, and she bolted up the sweeping staircase as fast as she could. She was clearly quite alarmed by the sudden commotion. What the hell, I thought, as another rock came flying through the window, missing me by mere inches. This wasn't funny at all. Someone could get seriously hurt. I looked down in horror at the shattered glass strewn over the floor. It was a complete, total and utter mess. My first thought was that some mischievous kids in the neighbourhood had learnt that a young student was house-sitting and took it upon themselves to throw rocks at me through the window as some sort of daredevil prank. I could feel that anger rising up in my chest. I'll make sure they pay for the damage, I thought, determined to catch the naughty offenders. I quickly switched on the outside light that lit up Elizabeth's yard quite brightly. I was expecting to hear little giggles and see little shadows darting behind the bushes in Elizabeth's yard, but that was not what I saw. Instead, I saw this large, dark silhouette that seemed rather obscure in the light. But what was it? This thing towered at about 8 foot tall and was covered in long flowing hair, and its overall body shape was distinctly human, with the exception of its arch-shaped head. I'd never seen or heard of such a creature like this before, that was so powerfully muscular, dwarfing a human dramatically, both in girth, size, stature and weight. Yet this creature was predominantly human. Yet aspects of the anatomy were strikingly ape-like. I was too shocked at what I was discerning that I almost forgot to be afraid. The only way I can describe it is when you are so shocked by something, it literally throws you off course, almost suppressing your emotional response to it. All this happened in what seemed like seconds, but the gravity of that moment was so large and impactful that every second of that moment in time was lengthened in my mind like an elastic band stretching in the hands of time and making them last forever. It was in that second I realized the creature was holding a limp-looking body in his hands. It was the motionless body of a woman. The creature placed the body on the ground, pointed to me, and then to the woman, and I sensed immediately he was asking me to help the lady. All of a sudden Elizabeth Churchill's warning words ran into my head. Please check on my neighbour Alice. She's a diabetic. I had forgotten to check on her friend. Was this the diabetic woman, I wondered? Was she in need of my help? It seemed very likely. I dashed hurriedly towards the woman, while the strange, reticent creature ran backwards, keeping a safe distance from me, standing next to a tall logpole pine tree and watching me intently. I began to slap the woman's cheeks to try and rouse her, but she was unresponsive to my touch. Her pale face was white, whiter than a sheet, while her eyes were rolled back in their sockets, and I could only see the whites of them. My heart began to pound frantically. I knew instinctively she was suffering from a diabetic coma due to low blood sugar. This was a life-threatening, serious condition that could potentially kill you, and it looked like this woman was hanging on to her life by a tiny thread. I ran into the house to call 911, my heart beating violently in my chest. I grabbed a Coca-Cola from the kitchen fridge and began reviving the woman by pouring it down her throat as quickly as I could. I felt for her pulse, and it was incredibly low, so low that I could barely hear it at all. But slowly and surely I could see her coming around. Her blue lips became pinker very gradually as the colour returned, and then they began to flutter. Then her bluish eyelids blinked, and slowly they opened, and a pink hue had returned to her skin. Slowly and surely she seemed to collect herself and promptly sat up, looking rather disorientated and muddled. In that moment I heard some happy, jubilant whooping sounds and looked up to see the strange creature jumping up and down joyfully on his powerful long legs, and his dancing was not unlike a human jiving and bopping to their favourite music. He looked terribly thrilled. I looked up again and he was gone, seemingly having vanished into the wood-green, knowing that his friend was all right. My heart sank because I had warmed to the creature and secretly wished he hadn't left. "Where am I?" said the woman, looking confused. "Who are you?" she asked, her eyes growing wide with fear, as if she believed I was some kind of horrible predator. She started to scream and cry out for help, but I began to calm her down. Calm down, calm down. I'm the house-sitter for Elizabeth Churchill. I think you've just had a diabetic coma. Elizabeth told me to phone you this evening to check that you were all right and that you'd taken your meds. But I'm sorry, I completely forgot." "Do you remember what happened?" I asked. I think I went into the yard to call my cat, and then everything went fuzzy and hazy. I don't remember anything after that. Thank you for helping me. You saved my life. I'm always forgetting my meds. How stupid of me. I thought I'd taken them." Before long the EMTs arrived and quickly whisked Alice off to hospital, but the very next day she was back promptly at my front door, armed with a large plate of homemade brownies, to thank me for saving her life. But I knew it was not me she should be thanking, so I invited her in for some tea. She was a delightful woman in her early 60s, with frosty purple hair, which was a common choice for senior citizens in the early 80s. In a trice I was putting down a piping hot cup of tea in front of Alice, who began to sip away at it happily. "Oh, this is lovely," she said. "I really appreciate a man that knows how to make a good cup of tea, and you do. It's quite a skill, you know. It's something that Elizabeth taught me all about, but she's got English ancestry, you know." "Can't say I'm surprised, with a surname like Churchill," I said. "You don't think she's related to Winston Churchill?" "I doubt it. I think I'd have known about it otherwise." "About yesterday. I'd like to take the credit for saving your life yesterday. Yes, I would, but it seems I'm not the one that you need to thank. It was a very strange, peculiar-looking creature covered in long, flowing dark hair that brought you over to the house last night and carried you in his long, powerful arms, alerting me to your dreadful condition. He was very concerned about you and waited to make sure you got up." Alice's blue eyes sparkled. "Well, I never! You mean Malachite brought me over to your house? He carried me here? Goodness gracious, that is extraordinary. I'd never have thought it possible. He's always been painfully shy. I wouldn't have thought he had it in him to alert you to my condition. I don't know what to say. I'm completely and totally overwhelmed." "Well, you should be, because this incredible, astonishing creature saved your life. In my book, that makes him a hero. Even more so if he overcame his dreadful shyness to come to your rescue. That makes him victorious to overcome such an impediment. I'm intrigued. Who is Malachite?" I asked. "Where does he come from? And why is he so attached to you? I've never ever seen a creature like him before. I'm not going to deny that." Alice's fingers began to shake, and her blue eyes glittered with delight. It was clear that she was touched to the quick that Malachite had saved her very life. She lowered her voice to a whisper. "I'll only tell you because you've seen Malachite for yourself, but if you hadn't seen him, you would dismiss my account and put me down as a crazy, batty old woman. I know you would." I thought about it for a moment, and I knew Alice was absolutely right. Who would believe such a nonsensical claim? I know I wouldn't. Imagine saying, "Oh, by the way, I'm friends with an ape-like humanoid." I imagine that would go down like a lead balloon, especially with all my friends, and eyes would almost certainly be rolled, and people would glance at each other knowingly, as if to say, "The man is a complete fruitcake, but we'll humour him." They would almost certainly think I'd dined out on magic mushrooms and was clearly hallucinating. "Go on, Alice," I said. Tell me everything. When did you first see malachite? It was winter, and it was freezing cold out there. I'd gone out to get some firewood, and I was chopping it myself, bringing it back into the house to make a lovely warm fire. It was so cold that day. The temperatures had really plummeted. The house felt like a freezer. That was when I heard a rustling sound, and the noise of my wheelie bin being dragged along the ground. I knew it was possibly a wild animal, and I peered around the corner to see a bear digging around in my bin looking for food. Despite the fact that it was covered with a thick, full coat of dark hair, it appeared to be shivering. In that second, the creature looked up at me, and our eyes met. I'll never forget those hauntingly beautiful eyes, kind but sad. They touched my heart deeply. "You weren't afraid?" I asked, looking surprised. "I mean, the creature is very intimidating. A lot of people would have screamed and run away for their lives." "No, not me. I'm not easily spooked," said Alice. "I was more concerned about the creature's welfare, and naturally assumed he was cold and hungry. I really wanted to help him. As you can't turn your back on all God's creatures, we should help whenever we can, and play our part." I looked at the creature and pointed at the house, and then to my mouth, and I started acting like I was chewing, and then I pointed directly at him. It was my way of expressing that I was going back into the house to get some food for him. I really sensed he understood exactly what I was saying, and I believe he did. When I returned to the bin with a large blanket and a bag of fruit, biscuits, and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches on brown bread, I truly thought he would have disappeared, because I could sense the creature was very evasive and shy, but he was still there waiting for me in expectation. I placed the blanket over my body to demonstrate what it was used for and put it down along with the food. The creature was standing about 6 foot away from me and inched forward very slowly, and when he discovered the peanut butter sandwiches, he smelt them first, took a bite, and waffled them down in a few seconds. He seemed so hungry, and then he wrapped the blanket around himself and glided back into the woods, glancing over his shoulders at me as if to say thank you. He was carrying the bag of food in his hands that I'd given him. Every day at the same time, that creature was waiting for me to bring him something to eat, and he would bring me little gifts like river stones, twigs, feathers, birds' nests, and stuff like that in return. It was his way of saying thank you to me. But we never ever got physically close to each other because of his painful shyness. Until now, of course. "Well, he certainly overcame his reticence when he found you passed out on the lawn like that. He knew that he wanted to help you. It seems like you have a guardian angel watching over you after all." All these years later, I know the creature I encountered that night, as a university student, was a Bigfoot. Sadly, Alice has long since passed away, but I'm glad to inform you that she died of natural causes and not of a diabetic coma, which could so easily have taken her at any time. I know her story would have been buried under the ground with her, never to be remembered any more, if I hadn't got embroiled in it in some way. She is not here to share her story with you, but I am sure she wouldn't mind me doing so on her account, and sharing her Bigfoot secret. I have 2 sons that refuse to believe that Bigfoot is real, and are always making fun of any believers. I have never told them my story, and I am less inclined to do so now, but I know that my secret is safe with you. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.